Chapter 2046. The figure that appeared was, of course, Luo Fan. Previously, he had been comprehending the various subtle changes that had occurred after the various concepts had been integrated into the world. He had not been in the mood to care about the choices made by the cultivators who had entered this world. He had even not imposed any punishment on those who had the intention to refine this world and take it for themselves. However, he had not expected that there would be a cultivator who could find him here and even use some power that was enough to disturb his cultivation to attack him. This forced him to wake up. After he woke up, he discovered a shocking fact. In the second level of the Tao Master's path, there was actually a cultivator who had surpassed the second tribulation besides him. It was a pity that although the two cultivators had attached a stronger concept to their power, the concept was still not pure. It was still obtained from a special cultivation method or from a certain extreme in some other direction. It was not something that was added to their power by truly comprehending the profundities of the world. This situation reminded him of the cultivator he had encountered in the rock-like world before. That cultivator had also used a similar method to integrate some chaotic concepts into his power. And that cultivator had obviously reached this step from the side because of the star wave, or rather the Tao Master's path. From this, it could be boldly deduced that the two cultivators in front of him might have also reached this step because of the Tao Master's path. That was why they had condensed a concept that was 10 times or even 100 times stronger than that cultivator's. Through this, naturally, it could be known that these two cultivators were not like him at all. They had not raised their own realm to surpass the second level of the Tao Master's path. That was why they had surpassed the second level of the Tao Master's path. Then, it was obvious what kind of existence they were and why they were here. They must have passed the second level of the Tao Master's path and stepped into the third level of the Tao Master's path. After that, they had returned to this place through some special means. I want to know, how can I enter the third level of the Tao Master's path? Luo Fan immediately said to them. These words instantly reached the ears of the thin bamboo pole and the slightly fat cultivator. It was like a roar of thunder that shook the two of them. This is not a secret. I don't think you need to get this information from us, the thin bamboo said at this time. Although he had already opened his mouth, his eyes were still filled with disbelief. Clearly, he still hadn't recovered from Luo Fan's unimaginable technique. To him, it was only natural. Luo Fan's means were beyond his imagination. After he stepped into the third level of the Tao Master path, his strength had already undergone a qualitative transformation. Although this transformation could not be described in words, and even he himself could not explain it clearly, it was enough to make him stand above all the cultivators who had not entered the third level of the Tao Master's path. It even made him feel, if he were to encounter himself before he had stepped into the third level, he would not need to use any method. He would only need to release a burst of power and suppress it slightly, and it would be enough to make him die without a grave. In fact, not even a single mark would be left behind. Under such circumstances, in the second level of the Tao Master's path, there was suddenly a power that could casually rub against him. He could even use such a superior attitude to comment that his strength had not reached the essence. How could he not be shocked? How could he not be in disbelief? He even suspected that the cultivator in front of him had gone against the flow from the higher level of the Tao Master's path to the second level of the Tao Master's path? If not, how could he have done such an incredible thing? When he thought of this, an indescribable excitement suddenly rose from the bottom of his heart. An indescribable hope suddenly surged in his eyes, and he suddenly changed the topic. Senior is indeed unparalleled, but in order to come here, Senior must have taken a great risk. Although we are not strong, I think that if Senior were to fight against us, the chances of you being discovered by the Tao Master's prison would be much higher than usual. Hearing this, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. In the blink of an eye, He already understood the mentality of the thin bamboo pole and could not help but laugh. "It seems that you think that I went against the flow from a higher level," he just said indifferently. At this time, the slightly plump cultivator had also come to a realization. A look of excitement appeared on his face as he said, "Is it not? We only obtained our abilities after stepping into the third level. To be able to take away our power so easily, how could Senior not go against the flow from a higher level?" Luo Fan did not bother to explain to them. He just said, "Whatever you think is up to you. Now all you need to do is to answer my question." The expression on the thin bamboo pole's face changed slightly. He said, "Senior, do you really think that you can defeat us? If we cause the power of the Tao Master's prison to descend, with Senior's status, I'm afraid that you will also be affected. Since both of us have scruples, why do you still want to fool us like this?" "You can try," Luo Fan said indifferently. The thin bamboo pole's body trembled slightly under the indifferent gaze of Luo Fan. After all, the difference in strength was obvious. Even if the thin bamboo pole thought that he had the ability to make Luo Fan fear him, he did not dare to ignore the difference in strength. At this time, he naturally had great scruples and could not directly let Luo Fan know that he could not be messed with at will. The slightly plump cultivator at this time sneered, "Don't think that you are great just because you are of a higher level. We have only gone against the flow of one level, but you have gone against the flow of at least 2 levels. If we are discovered by the Tao Master's prison, we will only be imprisoned for life. Moreover, with our means, we may be able to escape from prison. In contrast, if you are discovered, it is very likely that your soul will fly away and scatter. Such a different price. I don't believe that you are not afraid. If you have the guts, force us to flip the table." Hearing this, Luo Fan felt that it was even more funny. At this moment, he no longer talked nonsense, and his heart moved. In an instant, the still messy ideas contained in the 2 forces were purified, the ineffective ideas were extracted, and the effective ideas were greatly strengthened. With his action, the halo and the ribbon-like power suddenly trembled, and instantly emitted a light that was many times stronger than before. It looked like 2 huge suns were compressed above his hands. A kind of aura that was many times stronger than before was released from the 2. It caused the surrounding time and space to begin to distort. It even faintly changed the rules of law, so that the rules of law seemed to begin to respond to these 2 forces. How is this possible? At this time, the thin bamboo pole and the slightly plump cultivator could not help but exclaim. That was clearly their power, but in the hands of the other party, there was such a huge change. That kind of strengthening was almost like being reborn. This had already subverted their worldview. As far as they were concerned, their own power was completely their own. If others could break it, they could do it. Others could break it, and even control it, but absolutely could not easily change the essence of that power. What was the original power, unless they changed it themselves? Otherwise, in the end, the essence must be the only thing that would not change. But now, in the hands of this expert who might be at the 4th level of the road to Tao Master, this power directly changed, and even formed a strong oppression on them, as if a high and mighty deity was oppressing an ordinary mortal. That kind of feeling was so sour and refreshing. It went without saying, "Oh no, this expert in front of me is probably stronger than I thought. Maybe it is not from the 4th level, but from the 5th or even the 6th or 7th level." Such a thought flashed through the thin bamboo pole's mind. With this thought, cold sweat instantly came down. An indescribable panic and regret almost swallowed him, and his body could not help but tremble slightly. If it was the 4th level, then it would only be 1 level higher than them. Although there was already an intrinsic difference, and it was enough to suppress them, it was after all, not to the point where it was boundless. Their threat might not have a huge effect, but it would still have some effect. However, if the expert in front of them was from a higher level, Then, their threat was obviously as absurd as an ant threatening to trip an elephant. With the gap between the second and third level of the road of Tao Master, it could be imagined how incredible the divine sense of such an expert would be, and how much it would exceed the limit of their imagination. In the face of such an existence, he had no hope at all to complete his threat to the opponent. Perhaps before he could even take any action, the other party would have already stopped him. Thinking of this, Luo Fan's previous calmness had become a matter of course. Even such calmness could be regarded as the confirmation of his panic speculation. After understanding this, the thin bamboo pole was even more afraid. At this time, the slightly fat cultivator was about to say something, but the thin bamboo pole's face suddenly changed, and suddenly punched the slightly fat cultivator in the abdomen, causing him to fly out, directly across dozens of worlds before stopping. Blood spurted from his mouth, but his eyes were extremely blank. "Senior, please forgive us. Just now we were really out of our minds. I hope that Senior will forgive us and forgive us," the thin bamboo pole said to Luo Fan. This change in attitude was so fast that even Luo Fan felt a little unable to react. Not to mention the slightly fat cultivator. "Oh? Have you thought about it?" Luo Fan became curious. He casually kneaded the two powers that came from the two cultivators in front of him into a ball. In the blink of an eye, it was like kneading glutinous rice and sugar together. The two merged into one, turning into a completely different power that lay quietly in his hand. Such a performance made the thin bamboo pole's face change again, and he was even more convinced of his speculation. At this time, the slightly fat cultivator saw this scene and suddenly sobered up, cold sweat crazily pouring down. His eyes were full of fear, and faintly there was a kind of gratitude towards the thin bamboo pole. It was Luo Fan's performance that finally let him know that the thin bamboo pole did that to save him. He also understood that the cultivator in front of them, who they originally thought was from the fourth layer, was most likely a higher existence. At the moment, he did not stop the bleeding, and while spurting blood from the side, he came forward, bowed to Luo Fan, and quickly begged for mercy. Seeing their performance, Luo Fan could not help but be disappointed, sighed, and said, "I originally wanted to see your real means. I didn't expect you to give in so quickly. It's really boring." Hearing this, the two cultivators in front of him were slightly changed. Their eyes were both helpless and lucky. "No wonder you didn't say it clearly before. It turned out to be to lure us. Fortunately, I was smart, otherwise, I'm afraid I would be dead now." Similar thoughts flashed through their minds. Now, they no longer had the slightest confidence that they could receive the power of the Tao Master's prison in front of Luo Fan, and did not dare to hope that the power of the Tao Master's prison could help them escape from the control of this terrifying expert in front of them. "Well, answer my previous question." Luo Fan lightly rubbed the power in his hand. He said so. Hearing this, the thin bamboo pole and the slightly fat cultivator could not help but be slightly stunned. They did not expect that Luo Fan would actually want to know this. Although this question was not a big nor small secret among the cultivators of the second layer of the Tao Master's path, it was definitely not difficult to find out. Even as long as one had enough strength, they could understand it without asking. Under such circumstances, it was really difficult for them to understand that this expert, who was most likely an expert of the fifth layer or even higher, would actually ask them about this. However, even the imagination of ordinary people was extremely incredible. This kind of cultivator was countless times more powerful than ordinary people in all aspects. The ability of his imagination was even more terrifying. Soon, the thin bamboo pole thought of a possibility. Could it be, he has never reached the second layer of the Tao Master's path? Thinking of this, he was even more in awe, and the expression on his face became even more respectful. Not reaching the second layer of the Tao Master's path, but being able to reach a higher layer of the Tao Master's path. This seemed contradictory, but in fact, it was very normal. The most common situation for this to happen was that in the higher layers of the Tao Master's path, for example, the third layer of the Tao Master's path was born, and then continued to climb, and finally reached a very high level, such as the fifth layer of the Tao Master's path. In this case, it was reasonable that this cultivator in front of them had not reached the second layer of the Tao Master's path at all. The cultivators in the Tao Master's path were the existence of that kind of extremely high realm, the firmness of their heart, and the tenacity of their Taoist heart. For cultivators at this level, it was difficult for them to have feelings between men and women. As for things like giving birth to children, it was even rarer. However, rarer did not mean that it would not happen. There were so many cultivators in the Tao Master's path. Even if the probability was small, it was bound to happen in the end. Therefore, in any level of the Tao Master's path, there were actually some cultivators who married with each other and gave birth to children. And these creatures that were born because of the union of cultivators were naturally born in that level of the Tao Master's path. This kind of cultivator had a powerful background and a shocking fortuitous encounter. It was not difficult to cultivate a certain magical power. However, at a higher level, such a background would become their shackles. It made it more difficult for them to embark on their own path, so that there was a great chance that they would eventually be limited by their parents, and it would be difficult to surpass them. Under such circumstances, once a cultivator could break this shackle, it meant that their will, their wisdom, their Taoist heart, and their ability had reached an unimaginable level. At least, it was far beyond the realm of the cultivator's will, wisdom, Taoist heart, and ability. It was because of this understanding that the thin bamboo in front of him suddenly had a deep respect for Luo Fan. This was not respect for his identity, but respect for his great wisdom and his heart of the great Tao. The slightly fat cultivator's reaction was not so fast. At this time, he still did not react. He suddenly said foolishly, "Senior should have passed through. Why do you still need to ask us? Did Senior cultivate until his brain was damaged and forgot?" Hearing this, the thin bamboo's expression changed. He secretly regretted that he should not have gone against the flow to the second level of the Tao Master's path. At the moment, he quickly said, "Senior, please don't bother with him. This fool is a fat pig, and his brain is usually short of tendons." The slightly fat cultivator was somewhat indignant, but after all, he was not really stupid. At this time, he also realized that this was not the time to say such words. The thin bamboo was obviously saying this to save him. At the moment, he forcibly suppressed his desire to refute and directly shut his mouth. Luo Fan just shook his head and said, "I did not go through such a leap." The thin bamboo's heart was even more certain of his previous speculation. Without waiting for the slightly fat cultivator to speak, he quickly said all kinds of ways to break through the second level of the Tao Master's path and step into the third level. To enter the third level of the Tao Master's path, there was not only one way to enter the second level from the first level. According to the research and experiments of countless cultivators from ancient times to the present, there were at least two ways to enter the third level. The first way was to directly through cultivation and trigger the ascension tribulation of the second level of the Tao Master's path. Once this tribulation was passed, naturally one could step into the third level. The second way was to break through any kind of vision in the second level and naturally step into the third level. Chapter 2047. Listening to the description of the thin bamboo pole, Luo Fan suddenly felt that a vast world had opened up in front of him. After stepping into the second level of the Tao Master's path, he had been cultivating in the star wave. As for the other mysterious places in the second level of the Tao Master's path, he did not know. Now that he heard the description of the thin bamboo pole, he just understood that the star wave was actually just such an ordinary thing in this second layer. In addition to this, there were so many mysterious places that were no less than the star wave waiting for him to comprehend. Sure enough, entering the Tao Master's path is really the right choice. Thinking so in his heart, he could not help but show a faint smile on his face. Seeing such a smile, the thin bamboo pole naturally felt some kind of indescribable joy from the bottom of his heart. He felt as if he had been immersed in the sea of joy. All his experiences, all his hardships, and even all his losses, seemed to have no trace left in his heart. All that was left in his body and mind was that kind of unexplainable joy. He was like this, but the slightly fat cultivator's performance was even more excessive. At this time, he was even grinning. The laughter spread far away, and even stirred up many worlds in this side of the world, causing many worlds to begin to tremble, causing the creatures inside these worlds to be inexplicably frightened. They did not know what was going on and why there was such a terrible laughter. Not good. We were affected by his smile. After all, the thin bamboo pole was more knowledgeable. At this time, he suddenly realized what was going on. However, although he knew what was going on, he still could not stop the boundless joy in his heart, and it was difficult to control his smile. In fact, the reason why he was like this was very simple. It was because after these days of constant enlightenment, Luo Fan had unconsciously integrated all kinds of ideas into his body and mind. At this time, he was happy from the bottom of his heart. But it naturally integrated the idea of joy into his smile, and then affected the cultivators who saw his smile, so that they were infected by this idea, and naturally produced this kind of uncontrollable joy. As for why he was fine before, now it was even simpler. Before, Luo Fan did not have the joy from the bottom of his heart, so it was naturally difficult to lead the idea of joy into his smile. So that's how it is. Compared with the brand, this is a different kind of mystery. Soon, Luo Fan found that the two of them were embarrassed. His heart was bright. As he reacted, the idea of joy was gradually withdrawn, and the thin bamboo pole and the slightly fat cultivator naturally recovered. At this time, both of them involuntarily took a step back, and there was an indescribable fear in their eyes. At this time, the two of them could not help but take a step back. They knew that their joy was influenced by external forces, but they could not control it at all. It was like robbing them of their will. This was absolutely intolerable even for ordinary people, let alone for these experts who had already stepped into the third level of the Tao Master's path. If it weren't for the fact that they couldn't fight against Luo Fan, they would have already fallen out with Luo Fan and become irreconcilable enemies. "Thank you for your mercy, Senior." The two gritted their teeth. In the end, they could only bow to Luo Fan and said. Since they could not turn against him, they simply went to the limit and behaved as obediently as possible. "It was my mistake just now," Luo Fan just said lightly, but did not explain more. Hearing this, the thin bamboo pole and the slightly fat cultivator could only smile helplessly. If an ordinary person said this to them, they would have immediately turned hostile. But at this time, facing Luo Fan, they could only be more obedient and repeatedly said that it was nothing at all. No matter what Luo Fan wanted to do, it was up to him. "Why did you two come to this starwave station?" Luo Fan asked lightly. Just now, he was able to explain a little bit, which was already giving face to the two of them. At this time, he naturally could not be entangled in that matter. He did not want to entangle in that matter. The thin bamboo pole and the other cultivator did not dare to. Hearing the question, they did not dare to neglect and told him their goal. It turned out that there was a treasure hidden in this star wave that was said to allow cultivators to ignore the Tao Master's prison. As long as they could obtain this treasure, they could freely enter and exit any level to reach the Tao Master's path. They could even use all means to seize all the treasures that existed in the Tao Master's path. It could be said that this was the most powerful treasure for them who had mastered the Tao Master's path in reverse. This time, they heard some rumors that this star wave station was changing and was very likely to be destroyed, so they hurriedly left the third level and came here. Such a rumor actually spread to the third level. So, this place is about to become the target of many third-level cultivators? Luo Fan murmured. At this time, he suddenly raised his eyebrows. He suddenly felt that there were cultivators who were quite similar to the two in front of him, bumping into the range of the eternal world's perception. Moreover, there was more than one such cultivator, but more than a dozen of them. How many cultivators are there on the Tao Master's path in the third level? Luo Fan suddenly asked. No one knows. Maybe there are billions, maybe more. After all, the Tao Master's path is a supreme existence that connects the past, present, and future. Whether it is the cultivators who entered the Tao Master's path in the past or the future, they are all gathered together. The thin bamboo pole answered instinctively. But soon, his expression changed. He originally guessed that Luo Fan was a cultivator born on the Tao Master's path in the third level. Now that he heard Luo Fan's words, he was actually unfamiliar with the third level of the Tao Master's path. Didn't that mean he might be a cultivator born on a higher level? One wrong step and every step would be wrong. This cultivator's first step of deduction had already been wrong. No matter what method was used to deduce, the result could only be wrong. Even more, the more exquisite the method was, the more wrong the result would be. At this time, Luo Fan did not care what the thin bamboo pole thought. At this time, he was already shocked by what the thin bamboo pole said. Billions, past, present, future. He murmured in his heart. A cultivator on the third level of the Tao Master's path was equivalent to a three-tribulation expert who had passed through 3 great tribulations. Such an existence, even in the Tao Master Great World, would be an absolute expert. In an ordinary perfect world, they could even suppress all other existences except for true saints. Such an expert was actually measured in hundreds of millions. Even he couldn't help but be indescribably shocked. In contrast, the Tao Master's path was a communication between the past, present, and future. Although it was extremely inconceivable to combine the past and the future that were infinitely far away, the degree of shock was much less than that of the past. As a matter of fact, he already had a rough guess about this. After all, before he had really entered the third level of the Tao Master's path, he had gone through a fork to the past of the Tao Master Great World, and finally returned to the Tao Master's path with the guidance of others. Even the checkpoints before entering the Tao Master's path could be moved at will to the past of the Tao Master Great World. Then, the real Tao Master's path could directly integrate the past, present, and future. It did not seem to be an incredible thing. However, if it is really the integration of the past, present, and future, then it seems reasonable that there are so many experts on the third level of the Tao Master's path. With a thought, he changed his mind. Even if it was a perfect world, its history might be calculated in billions of years. The Great World had no tribulations and existed for billions of times longer than the perfect world. Even if only one cultivator could step into the Tao Master's path in billions of years, under the long river of time, the number of cultivators who could enter the Tao Master's path must be calculated in billions of trillions. Among these trillions of cultivators, even if the number of cultivators who could go to the next level of the Tao Master's path was only 1 in a trillion, it was normal for the number of cultivators to be calculated in billions when it came to the third level of the Tao Master's path. Even if the number of cultivators who could enter the third level of the Tao Master's path was calculated in billions, it could be seen how difficult it was for cultivators to step into the third level of the Tao Master's path. Thinking of this, his expression became calm again, and an inexplicable longing emerged in his heart. If this is the case, how many experts will there be on the 8th and 9th level? While he was thinking, the skinny bamboo pole and the slightly fat cultivator's expressions were incomparably perturbed. After a while, Luo Fan came back to his senses. He said to them, "You go back, this place will become a battlefield. The power of the Tao Master's prison should sweep through like rain." Hearing this, the thin bamboo pole and the slightly fat cultivator could not help but change their expressions. Although they behaved so lowly in front of Luo Fan, they were also experts who could go against the Tao Master's path. In an instant, they heard Luo Fan's determination from his words, and did not dare to hesitate. They quickly asked for leave from Luo Fan, and after receiving Luo Fan's consent, they turned around and quickly left this side of the world. Then they left the star wave and quickly returned to the third level of the Tao Master's path. They did not want to continue to stay on the second level for even a moment. Just at the moment when they were about to step into the ascension formation that they had prepared, a strange power suddenly descended where they were and instantly appeared in front of them. The moment this power emerged, the two of them felt an indescribable horror shrouding them. It seemed that in the next moment they would not be able to withstand the suppression of this power, and completely collapse under the power. "Oh no! He's going to attack us!" At this time, the thin bamboo pole exclaimed. In the second level of the Tao Master's path, the only existence that could make them not even the slightest resistance was Luo Fan, whom they had just met. Now that this power had appeared, the two of them thought that the only possibility was that Luo Fan wanted to kill them and silence them. "No, that's not right, this is the power of both of us," the slightly fat cultivator suddenly exclaimed. Compared to the thin bamboo pole, the slightly fat cultivator's mind was not as sharp, and his reaction was a beat slower. Just now, when the thin bamboo pole felt the irresistible power, he instantly thought of all kinds of possibilities. This slightly chubby cultivator was different. When he sensed the power, he didn't think too much about it. Instead, he began to sense the power and trace the source of the power. He wanted to find the purpose of the existence that released this power through this understanding. It was this difference that allowed the slightly fat cultivator to know what this power was before the thin bamboo pole did. Hearing his words, the thin bamboo pole was slightly stunned, and carefully felt the power that stopped in front of them. The expression on his face constantly changed. Finally, he let out a long breath, and with a wave of his hand, the power floated towards him. Finally, it fell into his hand, formed a small crystal, and slowly rolled over his palm. "This is our reward," he murmured. This voice was just audible to the slightly fat cultivator. After the slightly fat cultivator heard this, his expression changed slightly. Then, his fluctuating expression turned into a kind of indescribable excitement and gratitude. The two looked at each other, and immediately bowed in the direction of the star wave. Then, they turned around and stepped into the ascension formation, activating the formation. In a flash of light, the two of them had disappeared from the second level of the Tao Master's path, and quickly headed towards the third level. The power just now was none other than the power that the two of them had previously sent to Luo Fan. This power originally came from the thin bamboo pole and the slightly fat cultivator, and it contained the countless messy ideas that the two of them had added to it. For the two of them, this kind of power, it was just that the accumulation of their power was of no use at all. However, after being obtained by Luo Fan, he used his own will to purify these ideas, eliminate the messy and useless ones, and then mix the two, purify them again, and then eliminate them again. Now, it had turned into a kind of great existence that was rooted in their own power, but surpassed their own power. Such an existence, if they could comprehend it. Perhaps they would not be able to directly comprehend the fundamental mystery contained in it, but they could form a guide to improve their own strength, pointing out the direction of their own strength. In this way, the benefits to them were great. But it went without saying. It could be said that, to them, even if they obtained the hidden treasure in the star wave, it could not compare to this power. It was precisely because of this that the two of them were so grateful to Luo Fan. They were grateful to the thin bamboo pole and the slightly fat cultivator. Although Luo Fan saw this, he did not care. The most important reason why he gave the power to the two of them was that the power had already been condensed in his hands. If he did not give it to them, it would only be a waste. In addition, the two of them had been very cooperative and answered many of his questions. So, he gave the power that was going to be wasted anyway to them. Just as Luo Fan threw the power to the two of them, the cultivators who had also descended from the third level of the Tao Master's path had also arrived around the eternal world that he had opened up. The dozen or so cultivators were currently surrounding the eternal world, their eyes filled with curiosity and greed. As expected, the information we received was correct. This world is indeed very likely to be able to destroy such a star wave. An extremely fat woman said with great satisfaction. Goddess Zhong, it should be our turn this time, right? Beside her, an extremely thin middle-aged cultivator said. Of course you can do it. This is what we've agreed on before. However, you only have one chance. If you don't succeed, then don't blame me for taking action. Goddess Zhong chuckled. Although she was a woman, her appearance was rather repulsive. She did not have the appearance of a normal female cultivator at all. Humph. It's just a small world, what is it to us? Goddess, you won't have the chance to take action. The thin middle-aged cultivator's face was full of excitement and greed as he said so. As he spoke, he called out to the other cultivators and boldly rushed towards the world. In the blink of an eye, he had already rushed into the world with the other 5 cultivators and split up into 6 different directions. Vaguely, they formed a huge refining array. Like the cultivators in the second level of the Tao Master's path, they were also not affected by the rules. They did not randomly appear around the world that corresponded to them, but appeared where they wanted to appear. They're even wilder than the other 2. I wonder where this confidence comes from. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was watching all of this from the center of the world, did not know whether to laugh or cry. At this moment, the 6 of them were 100 times more arrogant than the skinny bamboo pole and the slightly chubby cultivator. From the looks of it, it was clear that they wanted to completely refine this eternal world with their own power. They didn't care at all about the possible rulers of this world, nor did they care about the obstacles that all the cultivators in this world might cause to them. At this moment, Goddess Zhong's expression slightly stiffened as she looked at the actions of the 6 of them. She thought to herself, "Humph, I didn't expect that they would use the safest method to refine this world just to be wary of me. It seems that this trip will be in vain this time." Chapter 2049. As they released their auras, an indescribable power appeared out of thin air around them. In a flash, they had already disappeared without a trace. Throughout the entire process, whether it was the world itself, the indestructible concept that gushed out from the depths of the world, or even the star wave itself, it was as if they did not exist and could not stop it at all. Sure enough, they still disappeared just like that. Luo Fan sighed inwardly at this moment. Although he had seen the Tao Master's prison capture people many times, he still could not help but feel how small he was every time he saw it. The smaller the momentum, the greater the control over the power. The power of the Tao Master's prison could easily penetrate everything and directly capture the cultivators it wanted to capture. This itself meant that the star wave, the world, the indestructible concept, and everything else were insignificant to it. Only in this way could it achieve its goal with just the right amount of power. As the 6 cultivators disappeared, the power they left in the world was naturally completely annihilated by the indestructible concept. In the end, it completely melted into the world and was difficult to find. After doing all this, the indestructible concept shrank slightly and had already retracted back into the small hole. In the blink of an eye, it was as if it had never been there. The entire world was restored to its original state before the 6 cultivators entered. There was no difference at all. Even the operating posture. There did not seem to be any changes, and it was still as calm as before. However, the world itself was so leisurely, but in the eyes of Goddess Zhong and the others outside the world, it was completely different. At this moment, the cultivators were all dumbfounded, and their eyes were filled with fear. What the hell happened just now? That power, Goddess Zhong murmured, and even her words were somewhat incoherent. This world. The cultivator with a protruding mouth and ape-like chin murmured even more. His emotions constantly leaked out from his body, stirring up the surrounding star wave and causing it to tumble endlessly. There were even faint, illusory worlds being born, but they were quickly destroyed and disappeared due to the changes in his emotions. It was obvious that this cultivator with a protruding mouth and ape-like chin was related to cultivation and emotions. Otherwise, with his realm, just the change in his emotions would not have triggered such a drastic change in the star wave itself. If other cultivators were to pay attention, they would definitely be able to discover some of the cultivation secrets of this monkey-like cultivator. Unfortunately, at this moment, all of them were already shocked by the performance of that world. At that moment, all of them were immersed in their own thoughts. None of them noticed what was happening to the cultivator's body. If it were us, we wouldn't be any better off than them. Another cultivator murmured. No. We will definitely be stronger than them. Goddess Zhong suddenly shouted coldly. It was her control over her own mind that was stronger. Now, he had recovered from the previous shock. At this moment, the monkey-faced cultivator's transformation had completely disappeared. His body returned to its normal appearance. The various changes that had appeared around him could no longer be seen. That's right. Now that we know the trump card of this world, refining it is absolutely not a problem, he said. What? You still don't want to give up? A dumbfounded cultivator exclaimed. Give up? Didn't you feel it? The indestructible aura just now. Goddess Zhong looked at the cultivator as if he was an idiot. The cultivator was slightly stunned. Then, he suddenly came to his senses. His eyes revealed an indescribable greed. That's right. It's the indestructible aura. It's indestructible. As long as we can get it, it's only a matter of time before we become indestructible and indestructible. As he said that, his body could not help but tremble slightly. What was the purpose of these people's tireless efforts on the path of Tao Master? Wasn't it to become a true divine? And what was the purpose of becoming a true divine? Wasn't the most fundamental to be indestructible and indestructible? And now, right in front of them, a world with the mystery of indestructibility was right in front of them. It was waiting for them to take it. What a great opportunity this was! If they let go of such a world, they would simply be struck by lightning. At this time, the other cultivators also came to their senses. Their eyes were filled with indescribable greed, and they were even faintly red. Seeing the change in the other cultivators' expressions, a trace of disdain flashed in the depths of Goddess Zhong's eyes. The fact that she could almost be the leader of these cultivators meant that she naturally had extraordinary strength and knowledge. Therefore, while the other cultivators only noticed how precious the indestructible aura was, she was very clear about how terrifying the concept of indestructibility was. What was the most obvious thing about an indestructible existence? Wasn't it a true divine? And there was no need to say how powerful a true divine was. The path of Tao Master that they had explored for countless trillions of years was opened by a true divine. Since a true divine was so powerful and terrifying, why would they think that an indestructible world would be weak? The monkey-faced cultivator also had a look of greed on his face, but there was a stern look in the depths of his eyes. His strength was inferior to Goddess Zhong, but his intelligence was extremely high. Moreover, he cultivated in a path related to emotions, so he was naturally aware of the changes in the emotions of the cultivators present here. He also knew that Goddess Zhong had already treated all of them as cannon fodder, and she intended to use them to probe that world. For any intelligent existence, no matter how strong or weak, it was unacceptable to be used as cannon fodder. Not to mention this powerful existence who had already reached the third level of the Tao Master's path. Faced with this fate of being used as cannon fodder, The monkey-faced cultivator's expression didn't change, but his mind was constantly working. He planned to think of a way out of this situation. Suddenly, his perception swept across the cultivators hidden around him. His face lit up and he smiled. I believe you've all seen what happened to you just now. Although we've seen it and know the trump card of the world, it's hard to say that it won't have other trump cards. We still need to think about it in the long run. Goddess Zhong nodded with a smile, but there was a murderous intent in her eyes. This was simply ruining her plan. The monkey-faced cultivator naturally knew what his words meant to Goddess Zhong, so he quickly explained his plan. So, we need some people to help us test it out. His words instantly enlightened all the cultivators present. That's right. Although we're the only ones from the 3rd level, there are countless times more cultivators on the 2nd level than on the 3rd level. Isn't this absolutely sufficient manpower? The cultivators all came to a sudden realization, and their eyes lit up with joy. Then, their gazes turned to the many cultivators hidden in the distance, observing the world and them compared to them. These cultivators from the 3rd level of the Tao Master's path could see through the obstruction of the star waves through various secret methods and indescribable means. The cultivators on the 2nd level of the Tao Master's path didn't have the means to clearly see what was happening inside the world. Even the cultivators who understood the star waves the best could only vaguely see the world and the incomparably powerful cultivators hidden around it. Under such circumstances, they didn't need to worry about those cultivators understanding what had happened inside the eternal world. If they wanted to use them as cannon fodder, they didn't even need to use coercion. All they needed to do was tempt them with words. Go find them and bring them here. Take it as a form of guidance, Goddess Zhong said indifferently. Hearing this, the other cultivators snickered. Without hesitation, they turned around and unleashed their power. Waves of power pierced through the star waves and headed towards the cultivators. Although cultivators on the 2nd level of the Tao Master's path could fuse their perception slightly, they still couldn't compare to cultivators on the 3rd level. These cultivators on the 2nd level had no ability to resist the cultivators on the 3rd level. Soon, several hundred of them were caught by them and thrown in front of them. Seniors, what instructions do you have for us? The cultivators were very sensible. After being thrown in, they immediately spoke in a very docile manner. The situation was stronger than they were, so it was better to be obedient when their strength was inferior. Even ordinary people would be very angry to be caught in such a rude manner, let alone cultivators like them. However, in the face of an existence that could crush them to death with a single finger, they had no choice but to suppress their anger. The one who was communicating with these cultivators was naturally the monkey-faced cultivator with the sharp mouth and cheeks. He immediately went forward and began to talk incessantly to deceive these cultivators. He kept saying that the benefits of this world were too great for them to swallow, and that they needed people to help them set it up. That was why he had invited them here, so that they could explore this world together and reap the benefits from it. This speech was truly a deluge of heavenly flowers, and golden lotuses sprang up from the ground. Even though these cultivators didn't have a good first impression of them, in the end, a small half of them were actually persuaded. As for the remaining half who weren't persuaded, they clearly knew what the other party's goal was. Naturally, they could see the situation clearly. Even if they could see that they were going to be cannon fodder, they could only helplessly accept the arrangement. Besides, although it was a bit humiliating, it was still a decent opportunity. If they could gain something from it, it would be enough to comfort them from the humiliation. In particular, they actually had another advantage in the Tao Master path. That was, they could use the power of the Tao Master prison to capture them at any time to escape the fate of certain death. Even though entering the Tao Master's prison might not seem like a good choice to most people, and could even be said to be a fate worse than death, it was still an advantage over certain death. This kind of method was not popular in the 1st level of the Tao Master path, but in the 2nd level, it had become a life-saving method for almost all cultivators. After all, the cultivators in the first level of the Tao Master Path were not strong enough. Once they entered the Tao Master prison, they would almost certainly be suppressed forever. In fact, no one had even heard of anyone being able to escape from the Tao Master prison. But the Tao Master Path in the second level was different. Here, their strength and cultivation were not something that the cultivators on the first level could compare with. Although entering the Tao Master prison was not safe, and it was extremely difficult to escape, there was still a 1 or 2% chance of escaping. Not to mention if they were prepared. It was not impossible to increase this chance by several times, although, even if it was increased, the chance was still extremely small. But compared to certain death, it was still a world of difference. It was precisely because of this that the second level of the Tao Master Path would have people using the Tao Master prison as a life-saving method. Moreover, judging from the behavior of the cultivators who came from the third level of the Tao Master's road, they seemed to be in a similar situation. They treated the Tao Master's prison as a place to save their lives. Perhaps they could even weaken the punishment of the Tao Master's prison. It was because they had such a life-saving method. Even though these cultivators in the second level knew that they were likely to be used as cannon fodder, they did not fight to the death. Instead, under the arrangement of Goddess Zhong and the others, they began to enter the world in batches. Even with the protection of various powers, nearly half of the first batch of cultivators that entered the world could not withstand the natural laws of the world. They were scattered to various worlds, and even thrown into those worlds, unable to gather together. If they wanted to set up the corresponding formation and complete the arrangement of Goddess Zhong and the others, it would naturally not end in a short period of time as they had expected. They're actually so weak. I've overestimated them. Goddess Zhong's expression was a little ugly as she looked at the many cultivators that had been torn apart. There's nothing we can do about it. After all, they're only cultivators in the second level. It's actually not bad that they could do this. The monkey-faced cultivator sighed. Now that the formation is incomplete, I'm afraid we can only experiment 3 more times. Goddess Zhong glanced at the cultivators inside the eternal world with displeasure and said so. That's not necessarily true. Although the cultivators have suffered some losses, we can find a steady stream of cultivators. After all, don't forget what kind of place this is. The monkey-faced cultivator said with a smile. Hearing this, Goddess Zhong nodded, and her expression became a little better. But it was obvious that she had not completely let go of her disdain for those cultivators. The formation that they taught those cultivators was naturally not the crude and refined formation that the 6th third-level cultivators had set up. This formation was a formation that was slowly permeating and assimilating. According to the principle of this formation, the aura that was attached to the formation would be dispersed to the entire world through the power of the formation itself. Then, with the help of the flow of the world and the formation, the aura would slowly penetrate into the depths of the world and fuse with the laws of the world and the origin of the world. This method was actually not too brilliant. However, it was one of the faster methods to achieve result. If they used other methods, no matter which one it was, it would not be faster than this method. The crude method that the 6 cultivators used naturally did not count. Soon, 3 batches of cultivators were sent into the formation. The 3 groups of cultivators were scattered all over the world. Under their guidance, they set up the formation and gradually activated the aura that had fused with the formation. They worked hard to fuse it with the world and into the depths of the laws of the world. This kind of infiltration wasn't too fast, but it was extremely determined. With the addition of 3 batches of cultivators and 3 formations, the final effect of the infiltration was also quite satisfactory. It seems to be quite effective. Goddess Zhong murmured. Goddess, don't be careless. Don't forget what they looked like at the beginning. The monkey-faced cultivator reminded her. Hearing this, Goddess Zhong's expression changed slightly. She would not forget that the 6 cultivators had been extremely successful in refining the eternal world at the beginning. It even made them a little jealous. The current situation seemed to be going smoothly, but who knew if it would be the same as what happened to the 6 cultivators at the beginning? Then get more cultivators. Goddess Zhong nodded and said directly. Hearing this, the others also showed expressions of agreement. No matter what, they would never step into that world before the final result was revealed. And if they wanted the result to be revealed as soon as possible, they naturally needed more cultivators as cannon fodder. I'll go find them. Among these cultivators, a woman who looked very thin said. Goddess Zhong was overjoyed and said, with fellow Taoist helping, it will definitely be a piece of cake. The woman smiled slightly and greeted them. Her figure flashed and disappeared in front of everyone, heading out of the star wave. After all, the star wave was only one of the unusual scenes on the 2nd level of the Tao Sovereign Path. Although it wasn't insignificant in the entire 2nd level, it wasn't very important either. Under such circumstances, the number of cultivators here was naturally only a very small proportion compared to the entire 2nd level. As a result, if they wanted a large number of cultivators to be cannon fodder, the best choice was of course to find them outside of the Tao Sovereign Path. The news that something strange was happening in the star wave had already spread far and wide. Currently, there were quite a few cultivators gathered near and far around the star wave. With a rough estimate, there were more than 1 million of them. Chapter 2050. The thin woman shouted, and an invisible sound wave mixed with chaotic ideas spread out in all directions. In the blink of an eye, it had already enveloped the millions of cultivators around. The cultivators had been paying attention to all the changes in the star wave and were already extremely vigilant. The thin woman's appearance was so incredible that they naturally saw it with their own eyes. However, they did not expect that this woman was a Tao sovereign from the 3rd level and not a cultivator from the 2nd level. They estimated that her strength was far from enough. They did not expect that she would be able to use such a wondrous sound wave to envelop them so easily. What are you doing? Some cultivators exclaimed. The power in their bodies surged and burst out with boundless power to attack the sound wave that enveloped them. At the same time, the millions of cultivators in the surroundings erupted with terrifying power to resist the sound wave. They wanted to completely shatter the effect of the sound wave on them. The power contained in the sound wave itself was nothing. Under the impact of the power continued to collapse. It seemed that the millions of cultivators had won. Alas, these sound waves contained many concepts. These ideas were extremely stubborn. It was impossible to completely get rid of them without experiencing the same impact. Therefore, even if the sound wave, which was the carrier of these ideas, was crushed, the ideas still existed and still enveloped the millions of cultivators. Under such circumstances, even if the 1 million cultivators escaped from the sound wave, they were still under the control of the thin woman. But they were still under the control of the thin woman. At this moment, the thin woman just smiled slightly. With a wave of his hand, the will that enveloped the many cultivators had already fused with the power that erupted from the cultivators, directly seizing the ownership of the power and using the power of the cultivators themselves to imprison them. The strange changes of the knot caused many cultivators to be horrified. What kind of method is this? How did you seize my power? One by one, the cultivators exclaimed. Their eyes were filled with indescribable horror and confusion. As a cultivator who could step into the 2nd level of the Tao Master Path, he must have been in existence who had done the 129,600 square meters of the 1st level of the Tao Master Path. Such an existence had naturally reached an unimaginable depth in their comprehension of laws and control of their own power. For them to have their powers taken away was like an ordinary person suddenly discovering that his body had been taken away. That kind of fear, that kind of bewilderment, it was self-evident. Come with me. There are plenty of benefits here for you. The skinny woman smiled. Her temperament became even more delicate. At that moment, among the million cultivators, thousands of them suddenly let out roars as indescribably loud noises came from their bodies. Terrifying shock waves burst forth from their bodies, completely dispersing the concept contained in the power around them, allowing them to directly break free. There are so many who have grasped that power, the thin woman muttered to herself as her eyes lit up. These cultivators who came from the third level of the Tao Master's path only knew the concept but did not know why. In their eyes it was just a kind of magical power. At this very moment, according to the thin woman's senses, the thousands of cultivators who had broken free had obviously also grasped a bit of power. Although it was far inferior to theirs, its nature was somewhat similar. It was with the help of this mysterious power that they were able to break free from the shackles in their bodies. After those cultivators broke free, they did not say a word and turned to leave. In the blink of an eye, they had already disappeared from everyone's senses. He left so quickly. The woman sighed. There was a look of disappointment and pity on her face. Although those cultivators had grasped a bit of the magical power of the concept, it was obvious that their understanding of the concept was not as good as the woman's. The purity of the concept was also tens of thousands of times worse than the woman's. They had obviously paid a huge price to break free from the woman's shackles of the concept. Now their combat power was negligible. It was precisely because of this that they did not take revenge on the woman after breaking free and instead turned to leave. You don't have to use the Tao Master prison. Although my methods are rough, I don't want your lives. I just want you to do something that won't cause any loss to you, the thin woman suddenly said. As she spoke, tens of thousands of cultivators had already activated the power of the Tao Master prison. They were directly grabbed by the Tao Master prison and disappeared under its shackles. These cultivators were cultivators who would rather break than bend. Even though the woman had said that, it could not change the determination in their hearts. It was only natural. When the number of cultivators increased, there would naturally be different personalities. Among the millions of cultivators, it was extremely easy to find some who would rather break and go to the Tao Master prison than suffer the slightest grievance. What a pity! The thin woman only sighed. She did not stop those cultivators who had used the power of the Tao Master prison to break free. In fact, she even took the initiative to release the shackles and let them leave. After all, the power of the Tao Master prison was not only effective on those cultivators, but it was even more terrifying for her. It seems that you have agreed to cooperate? Then, she turned to look at the others and the smile on her face became even more gentle. The expressions of the other cultivators were still extremely ugly, and they looked at the thin woman as if they were saws sawing at her body. Although they did not have the courage and determination to use the power of the Tao Master prison to break free, it did not mean that they had a good impression of the woman. At this moment, their hatred for the woman had not eased at all. If they had the chance to attack, they would definitely not let the woman have an easy time. The thin woman did not care about this at all. She raised her hand and grabbed. In the blink of an eye, the millions of continuous trials had already rapidly gathered towards her palm. In the blink of an eye, they had already condensed into a small world that lay quietly in her palm. After keeping all the cultivators, she thought for a moment and said to herself, although there are already 1,000,000 cultivators, it seems to be a little insufficient. With that thought, she turned her head and looked around. She began to search for more places where cultivators were gathered. Soon. Thus he confirmed his goal. In an extremely distant crater of the heavens and earth, there were hundreds of thousands of cultivators gathered there, looking at something in the crater. As a cultivator who had also experienced the second level of the Tao Master Path, the thin woman naturally knew what the deep pit was. It was none other than a phenomenon similar to the star wave in the second level. She even remembered that she seemed to have entered the deep pit to search for opportunities. It's you. After confirming her target, she smiled and her figure flickered. She turned into a stream of light and quickly flew towards the deep pit. In an instant, Pina had already crossed countless stars, spacetime, and worlds. Countless natural sceneries. In the blink of an eye, she had already arrived near the deep pit. At this moment, there were streams of light flashing in the deep pit, as if a great battle was taking place. It seemed that a large number of cultivators were fighting over something. Oh, so it's already this time. After all, the thin woman had already passed through the deep pit. At a glance, she knew what they were fighting over. The deep pit was full of countless traps. These traps could contain anything. Heaven and earth treasures. Space-time, magic treasures, cultivators, and so on. Almost everything could be found. Every once in a while, there would be a change in the deepest part of the deep pit, causing the traps in the deepest part of the deep pit to collapse, causing the various things hidden in the traps to erupt and gush out towards the surface of the deep pit. And every time this happened, it was time for the cultivators to fight over it. At this time, it was obviously the time when the traps broke. I originally thought it would only be a few 100,000, but it seems that the number has increased by more than 10 times. The thin woman's face was full of joy. Originally, she could only see the scene outside the deep pit and thought that there were only hundreds of thousands of cultivators waiting here. Now that she knew the situation inside the deep pit, she naturally realized that there must be 10 times more cultivators in the deep pit than outside. Feeling elated in her heart, she no longer hesitated and also let loose a soft cry. A wave of sound mixed with her chaotic thoughts spread in all directions, directly enveloping the hundreds of thousands of cultivators around the crater. The same scene as before appeared once again. Those cultivators broke through the sound wave, but they couldn't break through the shackles of the thoughts. In the end, the thoughts controlled their power and bound their bodies, making it impossible for them to escape. Of course, there were also a very small number of cultivators who paid a huge price to break through the shackles of the thoughts and escape. However, that was only an insignificant portion and didn't have much of an impact on the thin woman's goal. After repeating what she said before, a large portion of the cultivators yielded and were recalled into the spacetime above her palm. After cleaning up the cultivators on the outside, she turned her attention to the inside of the pit, to the cultivator's head. I hope fellow Taoist will show mercy. I still have use for the cultivators here. Just at this moment, a voice entered the thin woman's ears. Hearing this voice, the thin woman felt the mysterious power contained within it was not much different from her own. In other words, the use of thoughts. In other words, the person who spoke was at least a cultivator from the third layer like her. She frowned and carefully observed the scene inside the deep pit. In an instant, she was able to distinguish several special points among the millions of cultivators. That place looked as chaotic and dangerous as the other places, but in truth, there was some kind of deep order hidden within. Moreover, she was able to sense the wondrous effects of his concepts that he had purposely revealed. The thin woman weighed the power of the other party and wisely said, "So you are people of the same path. Then I'll leave it to you all," the thin woman said wisely after weighing each other's strength. This deep pit was in existence on the same level as Xinglang. Even Xinglang was targeted by them. It was not strange for this deep pit to be targeted. In fact, it could even be said to be a matter of course. "Thank you, fellow Taoist." The cultivator who spoke just now thanked her with a smile. Hearing this, the thin woman only smiled and said, "Take care," before turning around and heading toward Xinglang. Although more than 1 million cultivators was still not enough. But if they were used sparingly, that was enough. This was the case for this crater, and it was obviously the same for other anomalies, unless there was nothing of value in those anomalies. If there was nothing of value in those anomalies, there naturally wouldn't be too many cultivators gathered there. In that case, it was naturally impossible to find more cultivators, and the efficiency would be too low if one tried to force it. This was something the thin woman didn't want to do. Since that was the case, it was time to return to Xinglang to complete the mission. An existence like Xing Lang wouldn't be much of a hindrance to cultivators from the third layer. Very soon, the skinny woman had already returned to Star Wave and came to the side of the eternal world to see Goddess Zhong. "How many cultivators did you gather?" Goddess Zhong asked the thin woman when she saw her. Hearing this, the thin woman said with a bit of shame, "Only 1,000,000 or so. That's a bit too many." Goddess Zhong instantly understood what the skinny woman was trying to say, and she couldn't help but sigh. It can't be helped. Although it's not easy to go against the flow, there are still many cultivators who have mastered it. With so many people, there's no lack of cultivators who have the same ability and the same thoughts as us. Actually, we should be glad that there aren't any of our fellow cultivators involved in this matter in Xinglang. Otherwise, things would be countless times more troublesome, the monkey-faced cultivator said with some relief. Hearing this, the other cultivators nodded in understanding. Their eyes were filled with relief. Goddess Zhong took the time-space from the skinny woman's hand and began to release batches of cultivators. She taught them the formations and passed their auras to them so that they could set up the formations inside the eternal heaven and earth. These cultivators had already submitted, so they were actually relieved when faced with this kind of mission. After all, at the very least, they weren't being sent to die. They were just setting up formations. The safety was much better than they had originally thought. Immediately, batches of cultivators were sent into the sky. Formation after formation appeared in the sky and stacked on top of each other. Of the more than 1,000,000 cultivators, only slightly more than half finished setting up the formations. In other words, there were only about 1,000,000 of them. The remaining cultivators were either directly sent into the world inside the world, or they couldn't find their own location. Some even used the power of the Tao Master's prison to escape when they encountered some danger, because there were just too many formations to set up. Teaching everyone the formations, passing their auras to them, and sending them into the world to set up the formations took as long as 100 years. In other words, it would take 100 years for all the formations to take shape and envelop the entire eternal world. With so many formations stacked on top of each other, the process of injecting the auras of Goddess Zhong and the others into the depths of the world was naturally tens of thousands of times stronger than a single formation. In the next 300 years, the entire eternal world was already faintly emitting the auras of Goddess Zhong and the others. Because of the existence of this aura, the cultivators' feelings towards the eternal world had unknowingly changed. In a trance, it was as if the world was gradually becoming a part of them, an extension of their limbs. On this day, the monkey-like cultivator said to Goddess Zhong, "It went so smoothly. Looks like the experiment is a success." Goddess Zhong looked at him, then at the other cultivators. She could see the eagerness in everyone's eyes. "All right. Since we've come to this point, we shouldn't wait any longer. Now let's enter and truly refine this world." Seeing everyone's reaction, she smiled and said. Hearing this, everyone's eyes lit up, and they immediately said, "It's finally time." Then, they no longer hesitated. Using the connection between themselves and the world, they began to step into the eternal world one by one. They were directly distributed around the world, in the positions they needed to set up the formations. After arriving here, their respective powers and ideas began to communicate, and an extremely wondrous formation gradually took shape. This wondrous formation was not like the tens of thousands of formations that the millions of cultivators had set up before, which had their auras seeped into the world. Instead, the tens of thousands of formations from before were strung together, and the tens of thousands of formations were used as the foundation of the formation, creating a huge formation that was countless times stronger than the original formation. After this huge formation took shape, its ability to seep into the world suddenly increased by countless times. Surging auras frantically poured into the depths of the world, into the laws behind them. At this moment, their connection to the world had increased at a visible rate. In just a few breaths' time, they had completed an improvement that would have taken several years before. Chapter 2051. Goddess Zhong and the others were naturally satisfied, but the cultivators who were forced into the eternal heaven and earth to set up the formation were already in an abyss of fire. Previously, they were separated from each other to set up the formation. Although it was a little humiliating, it was not too painful. They would not suffer any damage because of it. After all, it was only a small formation, and one that was under their control. For them, who were at the second level of the Tao Master Path, it was nothing. It could not cause much damage. However, it was different this time. At this time, the control of the entire formation had been seized by Goddess Zhong and the others. Now, they had turned from the original players into chess pieces. The formation that he had set up had also changed from a formation that he could control to a meat grinder that he could not control at all. It was a meat grinder that was madly squeezing them at every moment. As a result, the pressure that they had to bear instantly increased by more than 10,000 times. At this time, they felt an unimaginable power being extracted from within their bodies, from their souls. The formation that they had set up seemed to have turned into a shocking beast that was frantically plundering everything that they had. Such bitterness, such pain, caused countless cultivators who were scattered all over the world to howl miserably. There were even many cultivators who could not bear the exhaustion and the hopelessness, and directly activated the means that they had prepared beforehand. They activated the power of the Tao Master's prison and directly used it to escape. Their perseverance all these years turned into a bubble. In the face of such a situation, Goddess Zhong only snorted indifferently and could not be bothered to pay attention to them. This kind of situation was unavoidable. After all, the power of the Tao Master's prison itself was a power that exceeded the limits of their control. Even if they wanted to stop such a power, there was no way they could do it. But they could only let it be. Moreover, the departure of these cultivators, to them it was not a big loss. After all, the formation had already been formed. Even if they lost the formation, it would not collapse. At most, its strength would be slightly reduced, but it would not affect the final situation much. And so on and so forth. After a few years, the situation finally stabilized. At this moment, the number of cultivators setting up the formation had been reduced by more than 10%. Although the remaining 90% of cultivators weren't the type who would submit to Goddess Zhong's orders, they were still the type who had extremely strong endurance. It could be predicted that if they didn't leave now, they probably wouldn't leave until the end. Goddess Zhong was quite satisfied with this situation. Occasionally, he would sweep his gaze across the crowd of cultivators, and his gaze would be filled with an indescribable disdain towards these cultivators. Her attitude was rather contradictory. To listen to his own arrangements, her heart was filled with disdain for cultivators who didn't leave at all, thinking that they didn't have any vigor. He didn't have a backbone, so he wasn't worthy of her looking at him differently. As for those cultivators who left, she didn't have a good impression of them. She even thought that they didn't have the ability to bear it, weren't firm enough, and weren't decisive enough. If he wanted to leave, he could have left a long time ago. Why did he wait until now and endure for so many years before failing at the last moment? This view. It also showed that she looked down on the cultivators on the second level of the Tao Master's path. Of course, with such a mentality, perhaps it existed in the hearts of the majority of cultivators on the third level of the Tao Master's path. 100 years passed in a flash. After 100 years of infiltration, at this time, this eternal world, from top to bottom, was already filled with the aura of Goddess Zhong and the others. Just by sensing this world, one would even have the illusion that it was Goddess Zhong and the others. And this world, after so many years of development, had already expanded to more than double its original size. If this world was said to be in existence like the sun in the star wave before, then it had now become the center of the entire star wave, a key hub that could shake the entire star wave. Such an existence hung in the star wave, and its conspicuousness had reached an unimaginable level. Although 1 million cultivators had been wiped out back then, after so many years, hundreds of thousands of cultivators had gathered around the star wave. However, because the 1 million cultivators had been wiped out back then, the cultivators here were no longer gathered together like before. Instead, they used various methods to hide themselves and spread out. It looked like a huge swarm of ants surrounding a huge caterpillar. Among them, there were naturally countless cultivators that had entered the star wave and headed towards this eternal world. However, these cultivators were either captured by Goddess Zhong and the others, or they had seen through the changes that were happening in this world and did not dare to enter this world. Therefore, even with such changes, the number of cultivators in this world was still the same as before, and there wasn't much of a difference. From a certain point of view, this had clearly affected Luo Fan's cultivation. However, Luo Fan, who was completely aware of all of this, did not care about any of these changes. On the contrary, he was using the formation of Goddess Zhong and the others to spy on their respective powers, to spy on their usage of ideas, and to spy on the various effects that could improve his cultivation under such circumstances, although his cultivation in this world had been disrupted for so many years. But on the whole, their losses weren't that great. On the contrary, because he had spied on the methods of Goddess Zhong and the others, he had gained some understanding of the third level of the Tao Master's path. On this day, Luo Fan's heart jolted and he recovered from his thoughts. Has it already come to this step? It seems that I can see what the tribulation of this world is. He looked at the world around him and sensed the powerful aura that belonged to Goddess Zhong and the others. A look of curiosity appeared on his face. Don't forget, although it was a coincidence that he had constructed this world, his first thought after constructing this world was to investigate the manifestation of the tribulations in this world. The tribulation that erupted from the world that was integrated with the concept of slaughter was the blood tribulation. The tribulation that erupted from the world that was integrated with the concept of chill was the Ice Age. Then, what would the tribulation that erupted from the world that was integrated with the concept of indestructibility be like? To this question, he had always been extremely curious and wanted to know the final result. It was just that the eruption of this kind of tribulation was really irregular, or at least he could not find any pattern at all. Just now, he did not use his own power to adjust it, and did not think of a way to see the eruption of this kind of tribulation as soon as possible. But now, with the efforts of Goddess Zhong and the others, this world could be said to have been suppressed to the limit. If there was a tribulation that was about to erupt, the consequences could be imagined. It must be very close. It was precisely because of this that he had such expectations at this time. It could even be said that it was because he wanted to see what the tribulation was that he had allowed Goddess Zhong and the others to carry out all kinds of plans. Otherwise, even if Goddess Zhong and the others' plans did not cause any harm to this world, he would not let them do as they pleased in this world. Just as this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, this world began to have an inexplicable change. An unimaginable tremor began to appear everywhere in this world out of thin air. There were countless sources of this tremor, and when all the tremors merged together, the entire world became blurry, causing the countless worlds in this world to shake constantly as if they were being grabbed by an invisible giant hand. At this moment, Goddess Zhong and the others' expressions changed drastically. What is this? Is this the final counterattack of this world? Such thoughts flashed through their minds. It must be noted that over the years, they had already deeply engraved their own aura into the depths of the laws of this world through the formation, so that this world now completely carried their own aura. This situation, from the perspective of Forge the Universe and the Magic Treasures, was about to reach the end. In other words, this world was about to be completely controlled by them. Under such circumstances, even if it was just a magic treasure, there would inevitably be a counterattack. Even if it was just a magic treasure, there would inevitably be a counterattack. If it was a world that was being refined, there would definitely be a counterattack. there would inevitably be a change similar to a tribulation that would appear to stop this final refinement. Under such circumstances, it was no wonder that they would have such an understanding and feel that this was the retaliation of this world. No matter what kind of counterattack it is, now that we've come this far, it's impossible to give up, Goddess Zhong yelled coldly. Hearing this, the cultivators all looked solemn. Just as Goddess Zhong said, they had spent so much effort and forced so many cultivators to finally reach this step. How could they give up just because of an unknown counterattack? Even if this counterattack could bring them serious harm, or even destroy their bodies here, they absolutely had to go to the end and see it to the end. With such a thought in mind, Goddess Zhong and the others no longer had any scruples. They began to activate their power even more crazily, trying to complete the entire refining process as quickly as possible. At this moment, the entire world underwent an extremely subtle change. Bits of strange power began to appear out of thin air in this world, covering all the cultivators in this world and the entire world. This power was extremely strange. Before it appeared, all the cultivators in this world did not know that this power existed in this world. Even after it appeared, the cultivators in this world did not understand how this power appeared. They only knew that in the blink of an eye, this incomparably mysterious power had appeared around them. To them, this mysterious power seemed to have existed in this world since a long time ago. It was so much so that it had already enveloped them since a long time ago. The reason why they did not discover it before was because their senses had been deceived. This feeling was something that neither the cultivators from the third level of the Tao Sovereign Path nor the cultivators from the second level of the Tao Sovereign Path were willing to accept. In this instant, their expressions began to change. They used all kinds of strange methods to test and experiment with this power. They searched for the characteristics of this power, searched for the possible effects this power could have on them, and searched for a way to escape from this power. For a moment, the formation in this world was becoming more and more chaotic. This chaos, this made it difficult for Goddess Zhong's powerful activation to produce any effect. Instead, there was a faint and inexplicable power that made them feel a little uneasy. Oh no! Could it be that this backlash is a retaliation? Goddess Zhong and the others had an inexplicable fear in their eyes. The retaliation of the heavens and earth could appear in any form. Even this kind of retaliation was not impossible. However, if it was really this kind of backlash, then they would be in some trouble. After all, in the process of their auras merging with the world through the formation, they had also deeply integrated with the formation. This deep integration, this made the formation almost like a part of their bodies. In this way, if the formation were to backfire, it would be equivalent to a part of their bodies betraying them. The terrifying consequences would be self-evident. Perhaps we should consider abandoning this body. This thought emerged in the minds of Goddess Zhong, the monkey-like cultivator, and the others. Before they could make a decision, the power that permeated the world suddenly began to take effect. These effects did not exist in the void that belonged to this world, but in the countless worlds in this world. Those worlds that combined the countless concepts in Luo Fan's worldview were already incomparably perfect worlds, even though the environments were different. Although the environment was different, their own laws were almost completely different. However, in every world there was a complete ecosystem. There was a complete civilization structure. In other words, in any world there would be countless living beings. And at that moment, in each of the worlds, more and more chaos appeared. After the power merged with it, a strange living being was gradually being modified. That's right, it was not being born, but being modified. Modified from the living beings that originally existed in that world. These modified living beings behaved differently in every world. Every world had its own unique characteristic, but they all had one thing in common, an extremely terrifying similarity. Indestructible. For example, an extremely ordinary living being. In a world without the existence of extraordinary power, an extremely ordinary living being would die after being modified by that power. Then, they would lose their rationality and come back to life with only their instincts left. They would begin to kill their own kind, transform their original kind into their current kind, and then continue to kill. This kind of living being often appeared in various literary works. They were zombies. This was only the most ordinary of appearances in a world without extraordinary power. In a world with extraordinary power, these transformed undead creatures would only be stronger and more terrifying. For example, in a world that had already given birth to a normal cultivation civilization, under the modification of that power, a kind of demonic soul would be transformed from a cultivator. This kind of demonic soul had completely lost its rationality and was left with only various instincts. And they were also unbelievably contagious. Any living being that came into contact with this kind of demonic soul would quickly be transformed into a demonic soul and similarly become unimaginably contagious. Every world in this part of the eternal world was the same. In every world, there was a similar disaster erupting. In just a few short months, every world in this eternal realm had turned into the end of the world. Originally prosperous civilizations were all destroyed, and all of them eventually turned into the same kind of civilization, a civilization of the end of the world. An unimaginable resentment and killing intent erupted from each of those worlds. The light emitted by these worlds grew dimmer and dimmer because of this change. In the end, they turned into dead stars that hung dimly in the void. So this is the tribulation of indestructibility. Luo Fan came to a sudden realization as he watched all of this. Didn't all the tribulations in these worlds originate from indestructibility? It was precisely because those who should have died were unwilling to die that all sorts of terrifying living beings were born, and that was why such a terrifying world of the end of the world was born. If there were such terrifying changes in these worlds, then the situation in the void outside of these worlds wasn't much better. In fact, because these countless cultivators were connected by formations, the changes were even more severe and tragic than in the other worlds. Although the power of the living beings in those worlds was far inferior to that of the many cultivators in the void outside, because they were independent from each other, a large number of living beings still survived in the end. They fought against the creatures that caused the end of the world and did their best to maintain the vitality of the world. Outside of this world, all the living beings in the void, including Goddess Zhong and the others, had been infected by that power and were transforming into indestructible creatures that had lost all sense of reason. Chapter 2052. As he roared, the cultivator's eyes turned white and his life source changed. A blood-red light radiated from his body and instantly began to spread along the connection of the formation towards the millions of cultivators in the formation. It was like the last straw that broke the camel's back. The cultivators who were already struggling bitterly began to be assimilated by that power. They lost their reason and turned into living beings that only knew how to kill and only knew how to kill. This is bad. We have to escape from this world as soon as possible. Goddess Zhong let out a loud cry. She ignored the connection between herself and the rune, ignored the connection between herself and this world, and brazenly severed all connections between herself and the outside world. As her power surged, she charged out of the eternal world. There were many cultivators who did the same thing as her. The monkey-faced cultivator, the thin woman, and the other cultivators from the third level all did the same thing without any regard for their own safety. Pft, 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 pft. Blood gushed out of their pores in an instant. The scene was unimaginably tragic. However, these cultivators completely disregarded all of this and tried their best to rush out of this world and escape from the star wave. At this moment, in their eyes, this part of the world was like hell in the eyes of ordinary people. It was incomparably dangerous and sinister. If they stayed here for even a little longer, it meant that their lifespan was reaching its limit. However, just as they were about to rush out of this part of the world, an indescribable force appeared out of thin air and acted on their bodies, pulling them back abruptly. Instead, they collided with the various blood-colored lights that were crazily spreading towards them at an even faster speed. This is bad. Our connection with this world is too close. Even if we cut it off like this, we can't completely cut it off. At this moment, they all cried bitterly in their hearts. Originally, they had worked hard to brand this world with their own aura, but now they realized that they had indeed succeeded in doing so. This kind of imprint was indeed successful, but after this success, it had instead become their shackles. It had become their noose, causing them to constantly move towards destruction and extinction. The speed at which the blood-red lights swept over was too fast, and the speed at which they were pulled back was too shocking. Therefore, they were completely enveloped by the power of the Tao Sovereign Prison before they could even activate it. With the support of external forces, the power that had been eroding their willpower in their bodies finally suppressed their rationality and all their resistance. It turned them into mindless monsters that only had the instinct to kill and devour. The roar instantly swept through the entire void. These monsters began to fight and devour each other crazily in the void. Even though Goddess Zhong and the others were much stronger than the other cultivators of the second level, they had already lost their rationality. Their greatest advantage over the cultivators of the second level, which was their ability to use their thoughts, was not effective. Therefore, even though they appeared to be much stronger than the other cultivators, however, in the end, he was unable to be as absolute as he normally was. He was unable to completely ignore the terrifying alliance of all the other cultivators. At most, there would only be 100 second-layer cultivators working together. He would be able to fight against them. In this way, the situation would naturally not be as one-sided as he had imagined. After those cultivators lost their rationality, their instincts were strengthened, and their understanding of the strong and the weak deepened. Facing Goddess Zhong and the others, who were over 100 times stronger than other living beings, they naturally began to work together. In the end, the situation became even, and the slaughter became even more intense, causing the void to be filled with chaos. The void turned into an indescribable azura hell. Such a scene was seen by Luo Fan. However, he could only sigh inwardly. What a tragic fate! Fortunately, I am the creator of this world. Otherwise, even I would have been affected. As he thought of this, the pity in his eyes deepened. The battle between these cultivators in the void affected the countless worlds in the entire world, causing the operation of those worlds to be disrupted. And the chaos in the operation of these worlds caused the operation of the eternal heaven and earth itself to become chaotic. The original state of balance with the star wave in the outside world was gradually disrupted. This situation, in the eyes of the outside world, was like the huge sun in the star wave had begun to distort. Countless rays of light began to shoot out from the sun, and in the blink of an eye, they returned to the sun and continued to disrupt the other worlds in the star wave, causing the star wave to become even more violent and chaotic. The star wave is going to be destroyed. At this moment, the cultivators around the star wave all had the same thought. With this thought in mind, the cultivators who knew each other looked at each other, and most of them turned around and walked into the distance, wanting to get away from the star wave. Of course, there were those who left, and naturally, there were those who chose to do the opposite. After all, the destruction of the star wave represented great danger, but it also represented a great opportunity. The star wave had existed in the second layer of the Tao Master's path for countless years. Although there had always been various changes, it had never been destroyed. But now, it was suddenly about to be destroyed, which meant that a shocking upheaval was about to occur. It meant that they were about to obtain something that they had not been able to obtain before. 4 cultivators who were willing to take risks. How could they give up on such an opportunity? Some of the cultivators who stayed behind began to set up various arrangements around the star wave, intending to intercept certain things after the star wave was destroyed. Some fearlessly charged into the star wave, wanting to obtain the corresponding treasures from within before the star wave was destroyed. Outside the star wave, it was already like this, and the changes inside the star wave were even more intense. Because of this, the entire star wave had been affected by the eternal world. All sorts of indescribable destructive fluctuations swept through the entire spacetime inside the star wave, causing changes to occur in every corner of the star wave. There were worlds that had not originally been subject to a tribulation. Suddenly, a tribulation descended from the sky, sweeping away all living beings in the world in an extremely violent manner, as if the world had experienced an entire lifetime. It began to move towards destruction. No one knew how many living beings died in the process. No one knew how many cultivators had been deceived and resented the heavens and earth. The power of the Tao Master's prison began to continuously appear inside the star wave, capturing one cultivator after another. They were thrown into the Tao Master's prison. In just a few breaths' time, the number of times the power of the Tao Master's prison had descended was comparable to the total number of times it had descended in the past hundreds of millions of years. Damn it! I was so close to getting it. No one knew how many cultivators who were wrapped up in the power of the Tao Master's prison roared. However, no matter how much they roared, they could not change the fact that they had failed at the last step. Parts of the star wave continued to collapse in the process. The various concepts and treasures in the star wave were constantly released during the process. During this process, it was constantly released and spread in all directions along with the destructive fluctuations that existed within the starry wave. Some even broke through the starry waves and arrived in the void outside, where they were intercepted by the cultivators. Of course, there were cultivators who successfully intercepted these treasures and obtained unimaginably huge rewards. However, there were also cultivators who misjudged the power of these treasures and ended up going for wool and coming home shorn. Even their own bodies could not withstand the impact. Even their bodies were shattered and their consciousness perished. This change caused the eyes of many cultivators who had stopped outside the star wave to turn red. Such treasures. It was such a risk, but it was enough to make them fanatic. In an instant, more and more cultivators began to gather from all over the second level of the Tao Master's path, causing the number of cultivators around the star wave to increase. As a result, more and more cultivators were unable to withstand the impact and died in the process of intercepting the treasures. The entire second level of the Tao Master's path was immersed in an increasingly fanatical atmosphere. The cultivators at the other locations of the phenomenon also began to leave after hearing the news. They were all heading here. 1 million, 10 million, 100 million, a billion, 10 billion in the end. In just a few days, the number of cultivators around the star wave had exceeded 10 billion. Such a large number of cultivators was not considered much in the second level of the Tao Master's path. It was not insignificant, but it definitely did not make up much of a proportion. However, it was unprecedented for so many cultivators to gather around the star wave at the same time. No matter how old a cultivator was, they had never seen such a scene before. They had never seen so many cultivators gathered around a certain phenomenon. It seems that a war that affects the entire second level is about to break out. A wise cultivator sighed to himself at this moment. With so many cultivators here, no matter how many treasures there were in the star wave, there would not be enough to distribute. And in this fanatical atmosphere, how could the cultivators who did not obtain any treasures accept their fate? Since they did not accept their fate, they would naturally snatch it. If they snatched it, there would naturally be a war. And once the war began, the final result would not be something that anyone could stop. The final war would definitely affect the entire second level of the Tao Master's path. It would definitely involve all the cultivators in the second level. The intensity of the slaughter would definitely reach a level that no living being could imagine. It was already foreseeable that blood would soar into the sky. Perhaps only other abnormal scenes would be able to avoid the effects of the war, however. Although there were wise cultivators who saw through all this, they were not willing to give up such an opportunity. They were not willing to hide in other abnormal scenes. After all, the destruction of an abnormal scene was a huge opportunity. The treasures that could be obtained from it were so precious that it was unimaginable in the past. According to ancient legends, there were even treasures that could directly improve the Tao Master's path by several levels. Under such circumstances, as long as a cultivator had the courage, they would not give up. How could they stay out of it just because of the risk and the war? The changes in the star wave became more and more intense and terrifying. The various impacts and changes in the eternal heaven and earth had completely changed the shape of the eternal heaven and earth. It was as if it had turned into a puddle of mud, constantly devouring the star wave and releasing all kinds of destructive auras. This kind of upheaval. Even Luo Fan felt a chill in his heart when he saw this. The influence of the eternal heaven and earth is actually so terrifying. Even the heaven and earth itself has obtained this kind of influence. If there is no external force to restrict it, I'm afraid that the star wave will really be completely destroyed. At this time, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and his expression became solemn. However, in the depths of this solemn expression, there was an inexplicable excitement hidden in it. Perhaps there will be an unexpected change, he murmured, with an indescribable expectation in his heart. The countless worlds that existed in this part of the eternal heaven and earth were all integrated with the concept of the world of laws, and they were extremely pure. There was no impurity in them at all. Under such circumstances, without the power of the same level of concept, it was impossible to destroy them. Therefore, even though the countless living beings in the void outside those worlds were engaged in an incomparably tragic slaughter, messing up the operating laws of those worlds into a mess, not a single one of those worlds would be destroyed because of this. The result of messing up the operating laws of those worlds was the release of various destructive auras, causing the eternal heaven and earth to start spreading in all directions, and gradually infecting the star wave itself. The eternal heaven and earth itself was already incomparably huge, and under this kind of change, the surrounding heavens and earth began to collide with it. And every world that collided with the eternal heaven and earth was like Mars colliding with Earth. Earth-shaking tremors were produced. Both of them were suffering from shocking destruction at the same time. However, just the difference in size alone was enough for the eternal heaven and earth to easily crush the other worlds, causing the worlds that collided with the eternal heaven and earth to completely collapse. Everything within them was completely thrown out, and then pushed by the fluctuations of the star wave, either towards the outside of the star wave, or directly colliding with the star wave. The eternal heaven and earth itself, on the other hand, only suffered some damage that was neither too big nor too small. And coupled with the concept of indestructibility that had been fused with the eternal heaven and earth, this caused the damage suffered by the eternal heaven and earth to recover at an unimaginable speed, and even the other side of the world hadn't completely collapsed yet. His body had already completely recovered. Just like this, more and more worlds collapsed. The chaos and destruction within the star wave grew stronger and stronger, and more terrifying, as the eternal heaven and earth collapsed. This, however, was extremely good news for the cultivators waiting outside the star wave. Because the more worlds were destroyed, the more treasures they could receive from the outside, and the more benefits they could obtain. In fact, to the cultivators who had already plunged into the star wave and started searching for treasures, this was also extremely good news. Because even though this made the environment inside the star wave even more dangerous, it also meant that their chances of obtaining treasures had become even greater. After all, there were only a few treasures that rushed out of the star wave. During this process, countless cultivators lost their lives to the shock waves produced by the destruction of the world, but at the same time, countless cultivators obtained enough treasures during this process, and all of them were so excited that their eyes turned red. What a cruel party! Luo Fan sighed inwardly as he watched all of this. At this moment, he was still at the center of the eternal heaven and earth. The entire eternal heaven and earth had become indescribably chaotic at this moment, but the center wasn't affected by the chaos at all. It was as calm as the eye of a tornado. Of course, this didn't mean that he didn't feel any pressure here. On the contrary, the pressure he felt here wasn't something that any other place could compare to, because the chaos in this part of the world had already surpassed a certain limit. If he wasn't here to suppress this place, the eternal heaven and earth would definitely collapse. After all, this part of the eternal heaven and earth was currently fighting against the entire star wave. Even if the star wave's power was dispersed, it was still an unimaginably colossus. The might, power, and concept contained within it all far surpassed the eternal heaven and earth. Under these circumstances, every time the eternal heaven and earth resisted the star wave, it would suffer an incredibly powerful backlash. If no one guided this backlash, it would definitely accumulate in this part of the world, and at some point in time, it would definitely tear this part of the world into pieces and completely crush the concept of indestructibility contained within it. And Luo Fan's role here was to suppress this part of the world and guide the backlash it endured, so that this part of the eternal heaven and earth could gain the upper hand in the battle against the star wave. Of course, right now, he was just borrowing the star wave's power to fight back. During the entire process of guiding, he was only using his own control over the eternal heaven and earth to divert the various backlash's power. He wasn't using his own body to directly resist that kind of power. If he could do this, why would he need to seek comprehension and fortuitous encounters in this star wave? Although the manifestation of the tribulations in this star wave was closely related to the world itself, the methods were also different. However, in the end, it still relied on absorbing the power, concept, and various other things from the star wave. Chapter 2053. The Carnival of War soon intensified. Phoenix /Phoenix quick update please search. When the first cultivator couldn't bear it any longer and attacked another cultivator to seize the treasures he had obtained, the horn for the celebration had already been blown. The battle began to spread rapidly. In the beginning, the battle was limited to the cultivators who were fighting for the treasures. However, as time passed and the scale of the battle grew, the conflicts between the cultivators finally erupted and the battle began to spread endlessly. A few days later, the battle had spread to the billions of living beings in the surroundings. The reason for the battle was no longer the treasures that had been shot out from the star wave, but the various grudges and karma of the past. In the end, no one could stop this war anymore. Fortunately, these cultivators placed great importance on their own lives, and most of them had already made preparations elsewhere. Once something went wrong, they would immediately activate their own preparations and draw the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison, allowing them to escape the fate of certain death through the Tao Sovereign's prison. Therefore, even though the war was in full swing and the scale was growing larger and larger, the number of cultivators who died in the war was still small. It was not enough to make the second layer of the Tao Sovereign's road become empty because of this huge war. Of course, although they did not die, they were still captured by the Tao Sovereign's prison. It was not something that could be done in a short period of time. Therefore, it could be expected that the second level of the Tao Master's road would be much emptier than before for a period of time after this war. Tens of billions of powerful cultivators were engaged in a fierce battle. It was impossible for the fluctuations and effects of the battle to not cause changes to the second level of the Tao Sovereign's path. In fact, a strange scene that had never appeared in the second level of the Tao Sovereign's prison was gradually taking shape in the battle. The strange scene was not stable in a short period of time, and one could only see its rough outline. It was a boundless sand field, or rather, a battlefield. In this battlefield, at every moment there were countless lights, countless powers, countless mysterious divine abilities, and countless unimaginable magical treasures fighting each other and this phenomenon. It happened to be in the vicinity of the star wave. As the waves of destruction emitted by the star wave continued to spread in all directions, the area it occupied began to increase. In the end, it turned into a behemoth that occupied a large part of the second level of the Tao Master's Road. It was predictable. If this strange landscape was finally formed, it might become another way to pass through the second level of the Tao Master's path, or perhaps, he could replace Xinglang, who was walking towards destruction, and become Xinglang's identity to pass the second level of the Tao Master's path. However, this could only be seen from a macroscopic perspective. For the numerous cultivators who were fighting and killing in that area, the phenomenon and the way to pass the second level of the Tao Master's path were all illusory. For them, the most important thing right now was their opponent. They were their enemies. It was the powerful cultivator who was attacking them. Apart from this, everything else was illusory. In fact, perhaps it was because of this mentality that the outline of the phenomenon appeared. After all, the phenomenon was born from the second level of the Tao Master's path. It could be said that it was a mark deeply engraved on the Tao Master's path. How could it be so easy to leave behind such a scene? If one did not have such a wholehearted mentality, how could they have done it? Everything that happened in the outside world was secondary to the cultivators in the star wave. There were endless worlds in the star wave and in these worlds. There were also countless living beings and countless cultivators. Since ancient times, countless cultivators had entered the star wave to comprehend the mysteries of the star wave and seize the treasures that might be brewing in the star wave. Under such circumstances, the number of cultivators in the star wave that belonged to the second level of the Tao Master's path was unimaginable. At this time, as more and more worlds in the star wave were destroyed by the tribulations of the eternal world, more and more cultivators left the world. They appeared in the star wave. After these cultivators appeared here, they were all terrified and panicked. They couldn't understand the changes caused by the star wave. They didn't even have time to think about the reason for all of this. They could only wholeheartedly resist the drastic changes of the star wave and resist the danger it brought to their lives. Many cultivators had no choice but to activate their own preparations in order to receive the power of the Tao Master's prison and take themselves away. There were even more cultivators who did not have time to do this before they were melted by the changes in the star wave. Their bodies were completely destroyed, and at most, only a few imprints were left. They were either sent out of the star wave or through various transformations, they were thrown into the eternal world and became part of the tribulations of the eternal world, pushing the tribulations of the eternal world towards an even more tragic direction. The chaos in the star wave stirred up all sorts of mysteries hidden in the depths of the star wave. The treasures that would normally only appear after many years appeared one by one. They were either devoured, destroyed, or directly sent out of the star wave. From the outside, it looked like specks of brilliance had appeared out of thin air. They were either extinguished, turned into streams of light that were thrown into the eternal world, or turned into streams of light that charged out of the star wave and into the increasingly tragic battlefield in the outside world. Amidst this, an existence that Luo Fan had always wanted to comprehend appeared. That was the wisp of primal chaos that was hidden within the star wave. This strand of chaos mysteries was formless and intangible. It was an illusory existence that was difficult to find and control. It was hidden behind the star wave, or rather, it was a manifestation of the structure of the star wave itself. At this moment, the star wave had become so chaotic that it was even moving towards destruction. However, it had gradually destroyed the foundation of this mysterious existence, causing it to have no choice but to reveal itself. Even if it was the power of a connate golden immortal realm cultivator, it would become a living being if it broke free from its control and obtained freedom. Although this strand of chaos mysteries wasn't power, its level was trillions of times higher than the power of a connate golden immortal realm cultivator. Naturally, it wouldn't be like an inanimate object that couldn't resist its own destruction. This strand of chaos itself actually contained some sort of instinct that was similar to intelligence. Under the urging of this instinct, this strand of profound mysteries was absolutely not willing to disappear just like this. It was impossible for it to be willing to perish along with the destruction of the star wave. That was why at the last moment, when the star wave was about to lose its foundation, it was truly revealed. An unintentional willow grows. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was suppressing the eternal world at the center of the eternal world, had a thought, and a smile appeared on his face. At this moment, he directly simulated his comprehension of this strand of chaos mysteries, causing the eternal world to undergo some sort of extremely subtle change. At the instant this change appeared, the shapeless and immaterial strand of chaos shook and suddenly turned from the depths of the star wave to the eternal world. It turned towards the bit of comprehension that Luo Fan simulated at this moment. It went without saying how difficult it was to change the eternal heaven and earth and affect the eternal heaven and earth when the eternal heaven and earth were in a state of eternal tribulation. Even if Luo Fan was the creator of this world, it was absolutely impossible for him to have an easy time, let alone for a long time. In other words, if there was no external force, then the final result of his modification of the world and his comprehension of the strand of chaos mysteries would be that this change would be swiftly erased under the tribulation of the eternal world itself. It was even to the extent that the intensification of this change would cause the tribulation of this world to become even more violent, and in the end, it would cause even more cruel consequences. However, obviously, such a situation wouldn't occur at this moment, because an external force had appeared. The strand of chaos mysteries was that external force. Moreover, it was an external force that was absolutely powerful enough to reverse and change everything. The injection of this external force instantly caused the minute modifications that Luo Fan had made to this world to completely stabilize. In fact, it even developed a step further. From what was originally only a rough simulation by Luo Fan, it became deeper and deeper, gradually replicating the strand of chaos mysteries completely. It became deeper and deeper, gradually replicating the mysteries of primal chaos, causing the eternal heaven and earth to undergo subtle changes. The strand of chaos mysteries was outside the world, in other words, within the star wave. It couldn't resist the influence of the eternal tribulation at all, and it couldn't stabilize the overall environment of the star wave. It should have been similar in the eternal heaven and earth. In other words, under normal circumstances, even if the strand of chaos mysteries had been injected into the eternal world, it would have gradually disappeared due to the destruction of the environment under the tribulation. In the end, it would gradually be destroyed. However, all of this was different because of Luo Fan's existence. For Luo Fan, since he discovered the strand of chaos mysteries in the star wave, almost all of his plans were to come into contact with them and comprehend them. For this, he didn't even hesitate to trigger the tribulations of the world. When the strand of chaos mysteries had appeared in front of him and entered the eternal world that had been born because of him, how could he just let the strand of chaos mysteries disappear just like that? Therefore, at this time, he was doing his best to guide the power of the eternal world itself and do his best to prevent it from destroying the environment of the strand of chaos mysteries. He did his best to preserve the foundation of the strand of chaos mysteries. Fortunately, he was the creator of the eternal world. The concept of indestructibility that formed the eternal world came from him. Otherwise, like an ant trying to shake a tree, his methods would have probably left him riddled with holes in the end. In reality, even so, he was constantly retreating at this time. He had no choice but to let more and more of the environment pass by. The area of the environment shrank and shrank continuously in order to reduce the pressure he had to endure from the world and the tribulations. In the end, he shrunk the surroundings to a few meters around him, which was the center of the eternal world. Only then did he barely manage to resist the tribulation and the pressure of the heavens and the earth, and preserve the profundities of the chaos. This was obviously where his true body was. The reason why this place could maintain this environment and resist the pressure of the world outside and the pressure of the tribulations was because it had never been invaded by tribulations. This was the only pure land in the entire world, or rather, the only pure land in the entire starwave. I've actually managed to capture this strand of mystery. When the pressure finally stabilized, Luo Fan suddenly felt an indescribable joy in his heart. At this moment, the center of the world where he was had turned into a state of chaos. It looked like it had turned into an egg of chaos. Luo Fan, who sat quietly in the center, seemed to have transformed into Pangu, as if he was waiting for an opportunity to split open the egg of chaos and split the world apart. The strand of chaos mysteries that originally existed in the endless starwave had been compressed into an area that was only a few dozen feet wide. Naturally, the chaos mysteries could not be hidden in the endless starwave like before. Instead, they were directly revealed in front of him, lying there quietly, showing him the endless truths and mysteries contained within them. At this time, Luo Fan no longer cared about anything else. What would happen to the eternal world? What would happen to the eternal world? What would happen to the starwave? What would happen outside the starwave? What would happen to the road of Tao Master? To him, all of these were far inferior to any change in the strand of chaos mysteries in front of him. With this understanding, he directly withdrew his perception that was paying attention to the outside world and completely focused on the strand of chaos mysteries in front of him. He began to feel the endless information that was transmitted from it. This information was extremely mysterious, marvelous beyond marvelous. Not only was it incomparably obscure and complicated, it was also constantly changing. At this moment it looked like this, and at the next moment, without warning, it would immediately undergo earth-shaking changes and become completely different from before. Luo Fan was already very familiar with this situation. At this time, his world view naturally emerged on the surface of his body. It looked like he was wearing an invisible armor covered with stars out of thin air. The number of starlight spots on the invisible armor was much greater than before, and it was also much brighter. There were countless nebulae that were taking shape but not yet fully formed. Every bright spot was swimming all the time, and the way in which every bright spot was swimming contained endless truths and endless cultivation mysteries. It was even enough for any cultivator who had stepped into the second level of the road of Tao Master to comprehend some kind of profound cultivation way. It could be said that, if the image of this invisible armor were to be leaked, it would be enough for the cultivators at the second level of the road of Tao Master to treat it as a treasure and start a bloody fight for it. At this time, as Luo Fan's mind was immersed in the endless information revealed by the chaotic mystery, bits of light began to appear on his body. They quickly gathered and formed a vague bright spot. It was like a nebula condensing into a star. Then, the bright spot quickly collapsed and turned back into bright light. A large part of the bright spot began to dissipate and became dim, looking like a star that had collapsed. Then, another bright spot was produced and condensed on top of the previous bright spot, causing the brightness of the bright spot to increase to a certain limit. It continued to condense and turn into another bright spot. Then, the bright spot collapsed again. Just like that, a never-ending cycle was started. Every time such a cycle occurred, some bright spot would remain. Finally, after a certain amount of light had gathered, it would turn into a bright spot that would never collapse. It would be integrated into the bright spot operating system on the surface of the invisible armor that was beyond the limit of description, making the bright spot operating system even more complicated and incredible. In this process, time gradually passed. 1 year, 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years. In a trance, it seemed that tens of millions of years had passed. On this day, Luo Fan suddenly trembled. he suddenly felt an indescribable sense of relaxation and contentment from the bottom of his heart. In this relaxation and contentment, all kinds of pressure that had been pressing on his body and heart suddenly disappeared into thin air. What's going on? He, who had been immersed in the understanding of the chaotic mystery, was at a loss for all these changes. He did not know what was going on, nor did he know what caused it. At this moment, he felt that the chaotic and mysterious existence's basic environment that was originally restrained within a radius of several dozen feet around him had started to expand wildly in all directions. The speed at which it expanded was so fast that it almost surpassed his will. In just a flash, it had already covered everything that he could sense. At the same time, an indescribable glow descended from the sky, enveloping the entire area that the environment had expanded to, causing the originally dusky environment to become overflowing with light. It was indescribably gorgeous and sacred. "This is my eternal world." In a moment of shock, Luo Fan had already understood where he was. This was the eternal world that Luo Fan had been suppressing all this time, the eternal world that was born because of the concept of indestructibility that he had injected into it. Chapter 2054. As the light shone, an indescribable feeling of sublimation appeared in his heart. In a trance, he felt that his mind was constantly expanding and growing. In the blink of an eye, it had already enveloped the entire eternal world. Just as his mind completely enveloped the entire eternal world, a feeling of disbelief emerged in his heart. "It's actually this kind of change," he murmured as his eyes flickered slightly. At this moment, outside the eternal world, there was no longer star wave, no longer chaos, nor was there an aura of destruction or tribulation. There was only a boundless void, as well as an unknown number of cultivators watching from afar. Further out, there were all sorts of strange sceneries and lands on the second level of the Tao Sovereign Path. As for the eternal world itself, it had already grown countless times larger. Just from its size and scale alone, it wasn't any smaller than Xinglang from back then. This situation was that the eternal world had already replaced Starwave, and had become a strange sight on the second level of the Tao Sovereign Path. It had become a way for cultivators on the second level to transcend the second level and step into the third level. In particular, at this moment, the eternal world was enveloped by the unimaginable light. The connection between the eternal world and the second level of the Tao Sovereign Path was gathering and strengthening. Vaguely, there seemed to be some kind of indescribable channel being established between this world and the second level of the Tao Sovereign Path. It made the two inseparable, and the various mysterious existences between the two were communicating with each other. Circulating, this situation made him even more certain that the eternal world had already replaced Star Wave. This was a change in the status of the eternal world. But the change inside the eternal world was even greater. At this moment, Goddess Zhong and the others had already disappeared without a trace inside the eternal world. Even the cultivators on the second level of the Tao Sovereign Path that they had captured were nowhere to be found. They could no longer be found. Even the traces of battle and slaughter left behind by them had vanished into nothingness at this moment. Not a single trace was left behind. It was as if there had never been a battle here. In contrast, the countless worlds inside the eternal world had become different from before. The levels of these worlds had passed through that tribulation. However, both of them had already undergone astonishing improvement. Now, those worlds were simply like the eternal world from back then. The void of the eternal world seemed to have no rules at all. At the same time, it seemed to be moving according to some kind of deep pattern. Furthermore, the scenes in these worlds were different for every world, or rather, every heaven and earth. Some worlds were still in the process of rebuilding after the calamity, while others had already developed civilizations that were completely different from before the calamity. Some suffered heavy injuries, while others soared into the sky. Among them, Luo Fan even saw countless cultivators who should have been on the second level of the Tao Master's path, had completely integrated into these worlds. To become an inseparable part of that world, to become a gear in the cycle of reincarnation of these worlds. The original concepts contained in these worlds had become existences like the great ways of these worlds. The many magical effects of these concepts had been perfectly integrated into every aspect of the world. Every magical effect had been greatly developed in the operation of the world. Even though Luo Fan had only glanced at it at this time, he could already feel the inexplicable stimulation of his world view contained in it. He faintly felt that his world view seemed to be absorbing some kind of nutrition to brew a deeper change. Such a situation caused him to suddenly realize that this was a great opportunity for him. However, it is said that one can leave the second level of the Tao Master's path and step into the third level after passing through a certain unusual landscape. Suddenly, this piece of information that he had heard from a cultivator on the third level of the Tao Master's path suddenly emerged in his mind. With this thought, he suddenly felt an inexplicable and strange feeling in his heart. This strange feeling was none other than a staircase, a path. This path was simply invisible. If one looked at it from a normal point of view, it was impossible to determine whether it really existed or was just an illusion. However, Luo Fan, who had sensed this ladder and path, clearly knew that it was real. Moreover, it was precisely because of the thought that he had just had that the ladder and path to the third level of the Tao Master's path was created. As long as he was willing, he could step on that ladder at any time and through that path, leave the second level of the Tao Master's path, and step into the third level of the Tao Master's path. At the moment when he had this enlightenment, another strange feeling emerged in his heart. "This is my fifth tribulation," he murmured, feeling the pressure from an unknown distance. Such a thought emerged in his mind. However, that strange feeling was exactly what he had sensed many times before. It was the feeling that the great calamity was about to befall him. It is indeed the Tao Master's path. In such a short time, I have actually sensed the existence of the tribulation again. Luo Fan could not help but murmur at this time. After all, it had only been tens of millions of years since he had passed through the fourth tribulation. This period of time might be extremely long in the eyes of mortals, but for a cultivator like him, it was not even the blink of an eye. If he could make a little progress in such a short time, it would be enough to make a cultivator at his level unable to contain his joy. But now, in such a short time after passing through the fourth tribulation, his cultivation realm had already grown to the point where he could sense the fifth tribulation. This progress was more than several times stronger. This speed was so fast. Even he could not help but feel like he was in a dream. Of course, right now, he could only faintly sense the existence of the fifth great tribulation. As for when the fifth great tribulation would descend, how much danger it would bring him, and whether it would be as unbearable as the fourth great tribulation, he had no way of knowing at this point in time. Only when his cultivation level increased in the future would he be able to sense this clearly. Although he was shocked by his speed of progress, but after all, Luo Fan was still Luo Fan. With just a little thought, he already understood why he could progress so quickly. After passing through the fourth tribulation, he had already stepped into the second level of the Tao Master's path. After that, he immersed himself in the star wave and began to use the heaven and earth within to comprehend the most fundamental point of chaos within the star wave. After that, he even comprehended the application of concepts through the heaven and earth that almost allowed him to be reborn. In this way, it would be strange if his progress was small. Although it was a little fast to be able to sense the existence of the fifth tribulation so quickly. But in fact, it was just a matter of time. After understanding this, Luo Fan's expression became calm again. With a slight thought, he directly swept the feeling of the stairs and the path directly into the depths of his heart. Now, the eternal world replaced the star wave and became the strange landscape of the second level of the Tao Master's path. This was a great opportunity for him. He could integrate himself into the many worlds, and the ideas in the many worlds would be more diverse and mysterious. In the end, it could bring him an unimaginable understanding. How could he give it up just to set foot on the third level of the Tao Master's path? Don't forget, the practitioners of the third level of the Tao Master's path would sneak back here from time to time. At this moment, the glow that covered the entire eternal world began to gradually converge. After a while, all the glow had completely disappeared. The entire eternal world had truly integrated with the second level of the Tao Master's path. Luo Fan could faintly sense that the imperishable heaven and earth had already become a part of an even more vast and inconceivable cycle. At every moment, there were endless mysteries, infinite information, and infinite principles that flowed into this world in a way that he could not understand, and then flowed out in an equally incomprehensible way to join the huge cycle outside of this world. Faintly, in the huge cycle, there were hundreds of similar existences that echoed with the eternal world. Beneath these hundreds of similar existences, there were even more vast existences that were hidden like underwater glaciers. There were inexplicable existences that were faintly connected to the eternal world. Are those the higher-level Tao Master's path, or the mysteries hidden behind the second level? This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Even if Luo Fan could slightly sense the more vast existences hidden behind it, he would feel as if he was bearing a heavy burden. It was as if he was not qualified to come into contact with and feel that kind of existence. If this feeling came from the higher-level Tao Master's path, he could accept it. After all, it was the Tao Master's path opened by an existence at the true saint level. There were mysteries that he could not imagine or understand. This was a matter of course. However, if this was the mystery behind the second level of the Tao Master's path, or if this was the real second level of the Tao Master's path, then the situation would be a little terrifying. Even he, who could sense the fifth major tribulation and had been divided into 4 tribulations in the Tao Master's path, was unable to sense the truth of the second level. Was there a secret hidden in the Tao Master's path that he could not even imagine? Although he hoped that this was the first situation, he was inclined to the second one, be it his reason or his intuition. After all, this was the Tao Master's path. With the strict rules here, would he be able to transcend the shackles of the level and sense the higher-level Tao Master's path just by opening up a world to replace the second level of the Tao Master's path? In this case, he naturally hoped that was the case. However, he still had this bit of self-awareness. Luo Fan stood there quietly and sighed in his heart. It seems that I will have to stay in the second level of the Tao Master's path for a longer time than I thought. There were countless thoughts in his mind. All kinds of thoughts kept emerging and being extinguished one after another. Suddenly, an idea emerged in his mind. What about the disciples of the true saint? Where are they? Under this light, the divine light in his eyes became incomparably serious. However, he suddenly realized that he seemed to have overlooked an extremely important situation. Since he stepped into the second level of the Tao Master's path, he had never seen or heard of any disciples of the Tao Master. Or in other words, there was no trace of the cultivators of the true saint's path. It was as if there were no cultivators of the true saint's path here. However, this situation was obviously impossible. Don't forget, even in the first level of the Tao Master's path, the disciples of the true saint had established incomparably large forces and absolutely suppressed the entire first level of the Tao Master's path. Even those forces of individual cultivators who had been suppressed by the forces established by these Tao Masters to the point where there was almost no room for survival, were all frightening giants. Under such circumstances, would those disciples of the Tao Masters really be limited to the first level of the Tao Master's path? In this second level, would they really not exist? And if they existed, would they really be as unknown as they were now? Thinking of this, his eyes were already shining with an inexplicable cold light. There must be a large number of disciples of the Tao Masters who had stepped into the second level of the Tao Masters' path. Moreover, they must have established a large force. He had not seen or heard of them at all. There was only one possibility, that was, they were not in his understanding of the Tao Masters' path. In other words, according to his understanding, the second level of the Tao Master's path in front of him was probably only a small part of the second level of the Tao Master's path. He was afraid that it was only a small part of the second level of the Tao Master's path, or even a very insignificant part. Outside of this place, in other words, in the place where he felt the great pressure coming from his heart, there was a wider and more vast area. Those were the places where the Tao Master's disciples stayed. And there, the environment must be countless times more wonderful than here. The higher the level, the greater the gap, and in the end, even the worlds of others can't come into contact with each other. This sentence emerged in Luo Fan's mind, causing him to involuntarily hang an inexplicable sneer on his face. He had stepped into the Tao Master's path in order to pursue the advancement of the cultivation realm, to overcome the great tribulations, and finally to become a true saint. All the plans of the Tao Master's disciples here were meaningless to him. But this did not mean that he was willing to be deceived, and was willing to be limited. I must break through the shackles and step into a wider area. He instantly made up his mind. With this determination, he temporarily stopped experiencing the worlds inside the eternal heaven and earth. Instead, he began to follow the senses of the eternal heaven and earth to sense the various things hidden behind the various strange scenes, and to find a way to get in touch with them. When he first sensed it, there was an indescribable pressure coming from the various deeper hidden secret areas, which made him want to immediately cut off this feeling. But with Luo Fan's current state of mind, it was naturally impossible for him to be forced to cut off this feeling if he did not take the initiative to do so. He withstood this terrifying pressure, withstood the terrifying torture that constantly washed over his body and mind, as if his skin was being peeled off his bones. He carefully sensed everything, searching for all possibilities. After enduring this pressure for a long time, one would get used to it. One would treat it as natural. It was the same for the terrifying pressure coming from the mysterious area. As time passed, there were even cultivators who entered the eternal heaven and earth, and began to explore the many worlds inside it, looking for the various hidden treasures. Only then did Luo Fan gradually get used to this kind of pressure, and gradually, he grasped the traces of the mysterious area. The resonance between the mysterious area and the eternal heaven and earth was the best guide. Through this resonance, Luo Fan began to spread his own senses. Following this resonance, he should have been able to easily come into contact with the main body that resonated with the eternal heaven and earth. However, his senses did not spread far, and already came into contact with an indescribable barrier. This barrier was faintly discernible, invisible and intangible. Before coming into contact with it, even Luo Fan did not notice its existence. But the moment he came into contact with it, he felt an unimaginable repulsive force emerging from it. The moment his senses came into contact with the barrier, it was as if he had suffered an attack of the same level, and instantly collapsed. Even his original body felt a burst of pain. Sure enough, it's imprisoned. At this time, Luo Fan was really convinced of his thoughts, and his expression became extremely ugly. From what he had seen, the cultivators who came back from the third level of the Tao Master's Road did not feel anything about this kind of imprisonment. Therefore, it could be imagined that, when they were still on the second level, this place was already like this. After thinking about it again, perhaps the third, fourth, and even higher levels were in a similar situation. Thinking of this, even Luo Fan could not help but feel admiration for the existence that could do all this. One must know that the Tao Master's Road had existed countless powerful cultivators from ancient times to the present, and even in the distant future. Stealing the sky and changing the sun under the eyes of so many cultivators, and imprisoning so many cultivators in an extremely small area without them knowing, this kind of method was shocking to think about. Chapter 2055. With my own ability, it's difficult for me to break this barrier that has been built for billions of years. I need to rely on external forces. All sorts of thoughts eventually converged into such a conclusion. With this conclusion, it was naturally easy to do what needed to be done. For him now, the greatest and strongest external force was not the half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure, but the eternal world, which had been connected to the second level of the Tao Master's Road and had become an extremely important part of it. This indestructible heaven and earth was extremely profound. It possessed boundless might and endless principles. If he could mobilize it, it would be equivalent to mobilizing a part of the Tao Sovereign's path. At that time, it would be a simple matter to break any barrier built on the Tao Sovereign's path. With such a thought in mind, he no longer hesitated and began to recall his senses, carefully sensing the eternal world. If he wanted to mobilize the eternal world, he naturally needed to have a deep understanding of it. It was like an ordinary person who did not even know how to use a computer. How was it possible for him to hack into a bank to change his savings? Now, for Luo Fan, using this indestructible world to break through that incomparably solid barrier was equivalent to an ordinary person trying to hack into the bank system to change their savings. Fortunately, the eternal world was ultimately born because of his concept of immortality. The countless worlds within it were worlds that had completely integrated with all the concepts contained in his worldview. Therefore, even though the eternal world had undergone earth-shattering changes compared to before, its foundation was still extremely closely linked to him, and there were still parts that he was extremely familiar with. Under such circumstances, he wanted to familiarize himself with the eternal world and achieve complete control over it. In the end, it was not a difficult task to mobilize all of its power. As Luo Fan continued to understand the eternal world, time gradually passed. For the cultivators on the second level of the Tao Sovereign's path, the appearance of the eternal world represented a brand new opportunity. A brand new opportunity. Such an opportunity, was hard to come by since ancient times. Combined with the legends that had been passed down through the ages, there were even many cultivators who suspected that the eternal world represented the hope of surpassing the Tao Sovereign's path. Because of this, after the eternal world completely stabilized and the light completely disappeared, a large number of cultivators from the second level of the Tao Sovereign's path began to enter the eternal world. They entered the worlds within to search for treasures and to comprehend the mysteries that were likely to surpass the Tao Sovereign's path. In just a short 100 years, the number of cultivators in the eternal world exceeded 1 billion. This was already more than the number of cultivators in any of the other abnormal landscape. After the 1 billion cultivators entered the eternal world, they were shocked by the endless concepts revealed by it. Perhaps they had all sorts of thoughts at first, but after truly understanding the world, they couldn't help but be convinced. In the end, they gradually immersed themselves into the concepts, or to say, their senses were incomparably profound. They began to comprehend the mysterious power that surpassed any ordinary power. Their actions strengthened the eternal world from another aspect, strengthening the countless worlds within it, causing the operation of the eternal world to become even more complicated. The evolution of the various mysterious mechanisms within it became even more exquisite. From time to time, there would be a cultivator who obtained a rare treasure in a certain world and left with great satisfaction. From time to time, there would be cultivators who comprehended a wondrous path of cultivation in a certain world and made great progress in their cultivation. From time to time, there would be cultivators who spread rumors of treasures being unearthed in a certain void, and so on and so forth. Although the eternal world had only just appeared, It was much livelier than any of the other phenomena that had appeared before. Moreover, the opportunities within it were clearly much more numerous than the other landscape. With such a background, the cultivators in the eternal world. Naturally, the number of cultivators kept increasing. In the end, after 10,000 years, when Luo Fan finally completely familiarized himself with the eternal world and even improved his understanding of the world through this familiarity, even the descent of the fifth great calamity seemed to have become much clearer. The number of cultivators in the eternal world had already exceeded 10 billion. On this day, Luo Fan returned to his senses and an inexplicable smile appeared on his face. I just happened to need your strength. With this smile, his mind moved. In an instant, the entire eternal world began to tremble. The tremors were extremely weak at first. In fact, if Luo Fan wasn't the cause of the tremors, he wouldn't have been able to sense their existence at all. However, as time passed, the tremors continued to grow stronger. Soon, they became so strong that even ordinary people could sense them. Due to the tremors, the countless worlds in the eternal world began to tremble as well. As they trembled, every world began to respond to each other. The resonance between them grew stronger and stronger, and an inexplicable connection was gradually established during this process. As this connection deepened, the countless worlds in the entire world were gradually strung together. The power of every world began to communicate and flow with each other, gradually forming an indescribable force. At this moment, no matter where they were in the eternal world, whether it was in the void or in the various worlds, they could faintly feel an indescribable power pressing down on them. It was also stringing them together with all the other cultivators, all the worlds, and even the eternal world. Under normal circumstances, if they suddenly felt like they were connected to some other cultivators, those cultivators would naturally struggle with all their might. They would feel like someone was playing a trick on them, trying to seize their power and make use of it. However, at this moment, it wasn't just cultivators that were being strung together with them. It was countless worlds. Instead, it was the eternal world itself that they had entered. Under such circumstances, those cultivators would only feel that this was some sort of special change to the eternal world. In fact, they would think that this was some sort of special opportunity that might exist in the eternal world. Because of this, they naturally couldn't struggle. On the contrary, they began to look forward to what was going to happen next. Could it be that the number of people has reached a certain level and a deeper world is about to be opened? Could it be that someone has triggered something and is about to open some sort of test or inheritance? Could it be that the treasure that transcends the Tao Master level is about to appear? These various thoughts caused the over 10 billion cultivators to become slightly excited. Their eyes were filled with indescribable anticipation. They're actually so cooperative. Luo Fan could even completely control the eternal world, so he was naturally very clear about the reactions of the many cultivators. At this moment, this was the only thought that flashed through his mind. Then, he no longer hesitated. He directly roused the power of the entire eternal world, the countless worlds within it, and the over 10 billion cultivators on the second level of the Tao Master Path. He followed the reaction of the eternal world itself and blasted it towards the barrier that completely sealed off this area. Ah! At this moment, countless screams rang out from various parts of the void within the eternal world. There weren't many of these screams that were tragic. Instead, they were mostly astonished. This situation was caused by the eternal world's performance being different from what they had expected. This part of the world's absorption of their power was simply too strong. It was so strong that they couldn't even effectively respond to it. All they could do was slightly waver, and all their power had been sucked dry. This kind of absorption was simply beyond the scope of their understanding. How could they not be astonished? Crack, 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 incomparably terrifying thunderclaps reverberated from the void where the eternal heaven and earth was located. Under this sound, circles upon circles of ripples began to spread out from the eternal world in all directions. It looked like waves upon waves were constantly surging outwards. Although the barrier had sealed off a large area, it didn't mean that it had surrounded the large area with a large number of unusual sights in all directions. In reality, this confinement was a confinement on a higher level, not a confinement on a spatial level. Therefore, that barrier was actually on a space-time level. It existed at the same time as any natural landscape. In other words, any unusual sight. In fact, no matter where it was, it would coincide with the barrier. As long as one could sense the existence of the barrier, as long as one could touch it, one could naturally start attacking it from anywhere. It was just like how the eternal world was attacking the barrier at this moment. It was attacking the barrier behind the eternal world from where it was. Crack, 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 crisp cracking sounds constantly came from above and below the eternal world. Cracks appeared on the eternal world, as well as in the surrounding void. Furthermore, no matter where they were constantly becoming denser, larger, and spreading. At the same time, the numerous cultivators within the eternal world were suffering from the pain of having their bones scraped and their marrow extracted. It felt as if countless sharp blades were slicing at every part of their bodies at every moment, and it even penetrated deep into their hearts and into their very essence. At this point, how could they not know that something was wrong with the situation? But what could they do even if they knew that something was wrong? At this moment, all of their power and might were being continuously extracted. Under such circumstances, any effort they made to escape from this situation would only become resources for the extraction of power, and they would be instantly extracted by the extraction of power. Under such circumstances, unless they triggered the preparations they had made in the outside world and attracted the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison, there was no way they could escape. What was even more difficult was that although the energy being extracted was so absolute that they couldn't resist it at all, but it accurately grasped the limits of what they could bear, causing them to lose all of their strength. All of their power was being extracted, but their lives weren't harmed. This made it impossible for the cultivators to make up their minds to guide the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison to escape. After all, being thrown into the Tao Sovereign's prison meant that they would be imprisoned until the very last moment. Not many people could risk it. Those cultivators had endured such intense pain. Luo Fan, who was controlling everything from the center of the world and guiding everything, was under even greater pressure. At this moment, the layer of the world of laws covering her body fluctuated violently. Every bright spot in it was like a source of fluctuations, constantly emitting circles of fluctuations that constantly spread towards the entire world view of laws. Countless densely packed fluctuations were constantly being generated and spreading. In the end, his figure looked extremely strange, as if he was completely formed by the endless fluctuations. His current world of laws was even able to support himself in a chaotic state for a short period of time. For him to be reduced to such a state under such circumstances, one could imagine how great the pressure he was under was. At this moment, his eyes widened and revealed an extremely strong determination. He let out a soft cry, "Open!" Following his cry, the aura on his body skyrocketed. In the blink of an eye, the cultivators in this part of the eternal heaven and earth knew for the first time. There was actually such an unbelievably powerful cultivator hidden in the eternal heaven and earth. In fact, it was also the first time they realized that a cultivator could be so unbelievably powerful. Is there really a conspiracy? At this moment, countless cultivators had the same thought. Following this thought, many cultivators didn't dare to stay any longer and tried to activate their bodies to guide the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison. But they didn't expect that they were still too slow. The power of the Tao Sovereign's prison descended at an unimaginable speed. Furthermore, no power or barrier could truly stop it. However, it still took time for these cultivators to carry out their thoughts. Therefore, when the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison descended, the void, it had already been broken. Or rather, it was a barrier that had imprisoned an unknown number of anomalies. It had already been broken. Behind the shattered void was a scene that they had never seen before. It was reflected in their senses, causing them to feel extremely regretful. They wished that they could turn back time so that they wouldn't have attracted the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison so quickly. At this moment, hundreds of millions of cultivators were directly captured by the power of the Tao Sovereign's prison and disappeared from the eternal heaven and earth. At this moment, outside the eternal heaven and earth was a vast and mysterious place that was filled with multicolored light. Apart from the multicolored light, this place looked quite similar to the area they were previously in. There were also unusual scenes scattered across the void like stars. There were also indescribably exquisite auras constantly being transmitted into their senses from all directions. However, the only difference was that this place was hundreds of millions of times larger than the area they were previously in. In the area they were previously in, there were only hundreds of unusual scenes. Although there were countless stars in the other areas, they were merely worlds or existences similar to worlds. But here, in the area they had just entered with the help of the eternal heaven and earth, there were countless stars and countless unusual scenes. There were no worlds or existences similar to worlds. How could this be? The cultivators who had yet to leave were already stunned. Why can I see so clearly? I'm clearly in the eternal heaven and earth right now. My senses should be obscured by the mist that fills the interior of the world, and I shouldn't be able to see beyond the world. Why can I see everything clearly now and even identify the essence of each star? Another cultivator discovered this huge doubt. At this moment, the existence that was constantly robbing them of their strength, robbing them of their might, and connecting them to the countless heavens and earth, suddenly disappeared. As the draining power disappeared, all the cultivators, even the weakest among them, completely recovered within a breath's time, as if they had not been drained at all. Every cultivator on the second level of the Tao Sovereign's path was an existence that far surpassed a supreme emperor. Such an existence could recover its own strength as easily as breathing in and out. Without this restraint, the over 10 billion cultivators were somewhat at a loss as to what to do. As the first cultivator began to step out of the eternal heaven and earth, more and more cultivators gradually began to step out. When they stepped out of the world, cries of surprise came from their mouths. What a dense power! Why is it that this is clearly the second level, but why is there such a dense power? The power they were talking about was naturally not ordinary power, but the concept that they regarded as mysterious power. Chapter 2057. Congratulations, congratulations on breaking free from your shackles. At this moment, a grand voice reverberated through the void, shaking the light that covered the sky. It caused the light to constantly change, condensing into countless strange forms. It looked like an endless amount of heavenly flowers, an endless amount of strange scenery. The voice contained all kinds of indescribable charm. All the cultivators who heard the voice could clearly feel that all the mysterious power they could touch and feel was stirred by the voice. Under this feeling, an indescribable sense of inferiority spontaneously arose. In a trance, they felt as if they had turned into mortals and were facing an immortal that was neither dead nor alive. Following this change, an overwhelming number of silhouettes appeared in the void. Every single silhouette seemed to be no smaller than the phenomenon. Floating in the void, they looked like mortals looking down at ants in a cave. Over 10 billion cultivators actually broke free from their shackles and stepped into reality. This time it is really a huge surprise. Another voice joined in. This voice also shook the mysterious energy that many cultivators sensed. In other words, it was the thoughts that filled the void. This strange scene has never appeared before. It seemed like they had relied on the opportunity of this phenomenon to break free from their shackles. It is a pity that they didn't break free on their own like I did back then. Suddenly, another voice joined in. Compared to the previous two voices, this new voice was much weaker. At the very least, it was not as many and powerful as the previous two voices. Although it still felt unstoppable, at least it was not as hopeless as the previous two voices. It could be said that if these 10 billion cultivators were to fight, they might immediately surrender when they encountered the previous two voices. However, when they encountered the owner of the last voice, they were still able to gather a bit of will to resist. They were able to erupt with even more power to attack him. At this moment, the light continued to condense and compress. Soon, it was compressed to the size of a normal person. It turned into several dozen figures and appeared before everyone. "Are you still unwilling to appear?" one of the men suddenly said indifferently. His eyes were like sharp swords, piercing through the barriers of the void and even the barriers of the eternal heaven and earth, looking into the eternal heaven and earth. In the center was a misty, special place. Although he couldn't see clearly what was inside, he could sense that there was a powerful existence that far surpassed the tens of billions of cultivators here. That kind of powerful existence. There was even an indescribably close connection between it and the phenomenon that had just appeared. It was even to the extent that he suspected that the reason this scene was able to escape its shackles and enter this area was because of that existence. At this moment, Luo Fan's figure materialized in front of them out of thin air. "This method of condensing an avatar is really amazing," he muttered after condensing it. There was a look of realization on his face, as well as an indescribable joy. The Luo Fan that appeared here was not his real body. It wasn't an ordinary clone or projection either. Instead, it was a kind of avatar that was condensed with the help of concept. This kind of avatar was completely condensed from the endless concepts that permeated the void. Everything that made up this avatar was the corresponding concept. Because of such an existence, not only did this incarnation possess unimaginable power, it wasn't much weaker than his main body. Moreover, it possessed an almost indestructible and unbreakable nature. After all, the concepts that made up this avatar were the endless concepts that existed in the void. Because of this existence's foundation, any power that wanted to harm this avatar would be transmitted to the surrounding void and to the endless concepts around it. In this way, as long as that existence couldn't completely destroy this entire area and the surrounding void, it wouldn't be able to truly harm this incarnation. It wouldn't be able to destroy this incarnation. This could already be said to be an incarnation of indestructibility. How is this possible? The expressions of the cultivators that had just condensed changed drastically. They didn't expect that the person in front of them could deduce this avatar technique just by looking at their avatars. It must be known that it took them billions of years to cultivate such an incarnation. "Which Tao Master's disciple are you?" the cultivator asked directly. As far as he knew, only a Tao Master's disciple could do such an incredible thing. It seems that my guess is correct. This place is indeed occupied by a Tao Master's disciple. If I'm not mistaken, every one of these unusual scenes has been refined by you. Now, there are only a few of these unusual scenes that are unoccupied, right? Luo Fan said thoughtfully. The expressions of the 10 billion cultivators changed drastically when they heard this, and their gazes towards these cultivators were filled with shock, fear, jealousy, and indescribable hatred. In the Tao Master's great universe, being a disciple of a Tao Master was the highest status apart from being a Tao Master. It could be said that although being a Tao Master's disciple was in the same universe as them, in reality, they were on a completely different level compared to ordinary cultivators, be it rogue cultivators or disciples of ordinary sections. It could be said that there was no connection between them at all. In this way, to them, being a Tao Master's disciple was an extremely mysterious realm, and mystery gave rise to reverence. Therefore, in the eyes of other cultivators, being a Tao Master's disciple was an indescribably terrifying creature. Anything related to a Tao Master's disciple was a symbol of power. For example, magic treasures refined by a Tao Master's disciple, elixirs refined by a Tao Master's disciple, or formations set up by a Tao Master's disciple, in their eyes, represented the most powerful treasures, under such circumstances. When they suddenly heard that these people in front of them were a Tao Master's disciple, the reverence in their hearts was self-evident. Then, they heard that these Tao Master's disciples had imprisoned them in a small place. On the other hand, they had occupied an area that was billions of times larger than where they were originally. They had even taken over the scenery that was originally shared by tens of billions of cultivators as their own. The jealousy, the anger, and the hatred were all self-evident. At this moment, one figure after another appeared around them. Waves of unparalleled powerful auras began to fill the void. The surrounding time and space seemed to freeze, and all the cultivators here felt as if their bodies were being imprisoned by these auras, as if they were no longer in control of themselves. You're not a Tao Master's disciple, but you know so much. You're qualified to join us. A cultivator that looked like an old man said. This old man had a sage-like demeanor, and his entire body lingered with the charm of an otherworldly master. The aura emitted from his body was powerful enough to distort time and space, causing countless worlds to be born and destroyed around him at all times. In fact, such a powerful aura. It existed on the bodies of more and more cultivators around them. Each cultivator seemed to be surrounded by a group of worlds, with light and shadow constantly twisting and changing. It made them look incomparably tall and majestic. Not interested. I came to the Tao Master's path to cultivate, not to become one of you, Luo Fan said faintly. At this time, his gaze did not fall on these cultivators, but on the unusual scenes that existed in the void. His eyesight was activated, and he tried his best to see through the barriers of the unusual scenes. He looked at the one who had refined the anomaly landscape within the anomaly landscape. As he looked, he was a little disappointed, but he also felt inexplicably excited. Among the many phenomena, only an extremely small portion of them had been completely refined. Apart from this small portion, most of the other phenomena were just a small portion that had been refined. In fact, among the incarnations of so many cultivators, only an extremely small part of the corresponding unusual scene had been refined. In other words, from the perspective of cultivation, these cultivators were only at the bottom of the hierarchy among the many Tao Masters. None of the cultivators who had completely refined the unusual scene had appeared here. As for how Luo Fan was able to determine which of those strange scenes corresponded to which cultivator here, it was needless to say. These cultivators were now releasing their auras without any concealment. If he still couldn't grasp the characteristics of those auras, then he could only commit suicide. Grasping the characteristics of the auras, and then using those characteristics to find the corresponding unusual scene was a simple matter. Joining us is the greatest cultivation, don't you know that, fellow Taoist? The old man didn't know that Luo Fan had already seen through them at this time. At this time, he still smiled and said. Hearing this, Luo Fan just shook his head indifferently. With a thought, the eternal world suddenly trembled and released an indescribable wave that swept in all directions. In the blink of an eye, the incarnations condensed from many thoughts shook and completely collapsed. All the figures disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye, as if they had never been there. As for the original terrifying auras that they released, the heaven and earth that were born because of those auras also disappeared without a trace with them. How is this possible? How can you completely refine the unusual scene when you just entered here? At this moment, such an exclamation came from extremely far away. In the midst of this exclamation, figures emerged from extremely far away and looked with indescribable shock at Luo Fan, who was still standing quietly at this time. Sure enough, this method can drive them away, Luo Fan murmured. Suddenly, a cultivator came up, bowed and asked, "This Senior, may we know what exactly is going on? Hearing this, Luo Fan just said indifferently, I borrowed your power to break the shackles, but I also helped you break the shackles together, so we're even. What you want to know, you can find out for yourselves. I have no obligation to tell you. Hearing this, that cultivator's expression changed slightly. This sentence was indeed reasonable, but it was only reasonable. After all, there was such a thing as human relations between cultivators. Normally, when faced with an existence like him asking for advice, any cultivator would at least be a bit tactful even if they were unwilling to answer. Who would be like this cultivator in front of him who did not care about human relations at all? This cultivator was ashamed and angry, and was about to say something. Suddenly, his heart shook. Maybe there is. That is, in his eyes, we are simply too inferior. Even describing us as ants is probably giving us too much credit. Only if this is the case would he act like this. Thinking of this, he broke out in cold sweat. If that was really the case, if he continued to bare his teeth, what awaited him might be an impatient slap from the other party. It was also directly smashed into pieces with a crack sound. At this time, Luo Fan no longer cared about this cultivator. With a thought, his consciousness incarnation began to frantically devour the endless multicolored light around him. In other words, that endless consciousness. As he devoured this endless consciousness, his incarnation began to gradually expand. In an extremely short time, it had grown from the size of a normal person to the size of the abnormal scene. In this state, he was even much larger than the cultivators that appeared here before. Even the incarnation of this consciousness incarnation was much more solid than the huge figures that they revealed before. If the figures of the cultivators before were illusory, then it was obvious that they were only condensed from multicolored light. In that case, his current body looked like it was real, and there was no difference between him and his shrunken body when he was a child. At this moment, a huge face appeared in the surroundings of the phenomena, looking over from afar. Among these faces, some were incomparably solid. For example, there were real faces like Luo Fan's that were made of flesh and blood. Some of them were rather illusory. At most, they were similar to the ones that the cultivators who had appeared here before had enlarged their bodies. These faces only existed in the surroundings of every anomaly. And the distance between each abnormal scene was extremely far. This should have made these faces appear extremely sparse, causing people to involuntarily ignore them. However, the presence of these faces was unimaginably strong. After appearing around the abnormal scenes, all the attention that was directed at the abnormal scenes naturally shifted to these faces. In this way, the abnormal scenes in the void looked like huge faces that shone on all the cultivators that could see them from afar. This kind of scene was extremely horrifying and extremely strange. There were men and women, old and young, benevolent and cruel, sad and happy, helpless and happy, and all kinds of other faces. Almost all the possible situations that a living being could have were revealed. Among them, at least 80% are disciples of the Tao Master. Luo Fan sighed. It was actually very easy to distinguish whether they were disciples of the Tao Master or not. It was enough to see whether they knew how or why to use their concept. This was the Tao Master's great world, and those disciples of the true saints were the Tao Master's personal disciples. Under such circumstances, how could those disciples of the Tao Master not know the magic of concepts? Perhaps, like Luo Fan, some of them were condensing their own worldviews in order to use their own worldviews to support their eternal existence in the state of chaos. In contrast, those rogue cultivators did not have the true teachings of the Tao Master, but they only knew how to use their concept. Perhaps through various other means and opportunities, they could control and use their concepts, but in the end they did not know the importance of the worldview, did not know how to organize and improve their own worldview, and did not know how to use the worldview to improve themselves. The aura formed by these two states was obviously completely different. In other words, at this moment, among the many faces that existed in the void, Luo Fan only needed to look at them to know which ones knew why and which ones just knew how. Thus, he could naturally infer which ones were disciples of the Tao Master, which ones were disciples of the true saints, and which ones were ordinary cultivators who had entered this area by chance to refine some strange landscape. You're very strong. But you shouldn't be here. Suddenly, a loud voice came into Luo Fan's ears out of nowhere. This voice was much louder and more mysterious than the previous voices. With this voice, the light in the void naturally evolved into all things in the world and all living beings in the universe. It looked as if the world was being created again. Seeing this, Luo Fan raised his eyebrows and said, "Not bad, but it's a little flashy. Can you imagine the means of the Tao Master's disciples? I'm only doing this to tell you that this is not a place where you can do as you please," the voice said again. His voice spread throughout the entire area and into the billions of anomalies in the area. Any cultivator who heard this voice couldn't believe their ears. Did I hear it wrong? Just now, the Tao Master's disciple seemed to be admitting his inferiority. A cultivator murmured, "You didn't hear it wrong. The Tao Master's disciple is indeed admitting his inferiority. He thinks that the person he's talking to is stronger than him." A cultivator who heard this responded. Chapter 2058. The Tao Master's disciple actually told the rogue cultivator that he could not do whatever he wanted here. This was simply like a weakling who had been forced into a corner telling a strong person, "What kind of backer do I have? You can't do anything to me." When had such a situation ever happened to a Tao Master's disciple before? Even if it had happened before, it must have been to the disciples of other Tao Masters. How could he say such a thing to a rogue cultivator who was not a Tao Master's disciple? This situation suddenly made those cultivators feel that the world had changed. Had they come to another reality? The disciples of the Tao Masters naturally understood the surprise and discussion of these cultivators. However, although they understood this, none of the disciples of the Tao Masters showed any extreme reactions. They were extremely proud of their status as disciples of the Tao Masters and thought that it was enough to distinguish them from all other cultivators, putting them in a position that was far superior to any other cultivator. However, this did not mean that they had become blind, nor did it mean that they would be blinded by this position. They would never fight to the death with an existence that they could not resist for the sake of face. Obviously, in their eyes, Luo Fan, who had just appeared in this area with a strange phenomenon, was an expert that they could not resist. In the face of such an expert, it was not a shameful thing to admit inferiority. They would be laughed at by others for admitting inferiority to such an expert. It was even less of a big deal. Of course, it wasn't because they were open-minded or carefree. It was, with their wisdom, they were confident that the cultivators who laughed at them would eventually find out that they were the ones who should laugh at them. Now, the more actively those cultivators laughed at them, the happier they would be in the end. Do whatever you want? It's quite ironic for you to say this, Luo Fan said lightly. His voice was leisurely. It spread throughout the entire area. It spread throughout the countless strange phenomena in the void, so that all the cultivators could clearly hear his words. This is the Tao Master's path. It was originally created by the elders of our sect. We have the most advantageous opportunity, so what's wrong with that? Furthermore, we've never restricted other cultivators from entering this place to share their opportunities with us. Just like now, when you enter, shouldn't we also express our welcome? The face said indifferently. Hearing this, all the cultivators were speechless. From a certain point of view, what this cultivator said was truly irrefutable. After all, the Tao Master's path was opened by many Tao Masters. For the disciples of the Tao Masters, wasn't this path created by their masters? If it was him, he would probably be heartbroken if he shared even a tiny bit of the opportunity created by his own stone door with an outsider. With this in mind, the Tao Master's disciples divided up this large area and monopolized it. There didn't seem to be anything unacceptable. The elders of the sect opened it? Luo Fan sneered. I'm afraid there were many Tao Masters who went through the Tao Master path and became Tao Masters. How many of you are disciples of such a Tao Master? This made the cultivator fall into silence. It was undeniable that there were many Tao Masters who obtained opportunities from the Tao Master path and became Tao Masters. In fact, they occupied 70 to 80% of the 3,000 Tao Masters in the Tao Master Great Universe. And among these Tao Masters, most of them were disciples of the previous Tao Masters. From the perspective of inheritance, the disciples of these Tao Masters could be said to be the disciples of the Tao Masters who first opened up the path of Tao Master. However, it was undeniable that there were also a small number of individual cultivators among the 70 to 80% of Tao Masters. In other words, they were not disciples of the previous Tao Masters. For these Tao Masters, unless they regarded the Tao Master path as the inheritance line of the first Tao Masters, it was difficult to be related to the Tao Masters who first opened the Tao Master path. In the end, Luo Fan made the final conclusion and said indifferently, "It's just a difference between the strong and the weak." Hearing this, the expressions of the faces in front of the many strange scenes changed. Although it was only a few words, Luo Fan's words had actually torn apart their original memorial archway. Now, unless there was an outbreak of internal strife and a small number of Tao Masters were separated, it would be difficult to justify their monopolization of most of the opportunities here. Perhaps that's the case. In the end, the face that spoke just now sighed and admitted it. Although it seemed that he had been forced by Luo Fan to admit the fact that he had denied before, there was not the slightest bit of shame on his face, nor did he have any intention of correcting himself. There was only indifference, only calmness. In fact, there was really nothing to be ashamed of, nor was there anything to be corrected. In any world, the weak were prey to the strong. With strength, one could naturally occupy more resources. Without strength, one could only obtain the leftovers after the experts occupied the resources. In this respect, these Tao Masters were actually considered to be lenient. Fellow Taoist, your strength has far surpassed the second level. You'd better leave quickly and go to a higher level. The face changed the topic at this time and said, "Exactly. With your strength, it will be too much pressure for us here. It will greatly damage the balance of the entire second level, so we'd better hurry up and go to a higher level." One by one, the faces began to echo. In an instant, a huge sound wave formed in the entire area, rolling towards where Luo Fan was from all directions, causing the endless rays of light in the void to begin to surge, faintly forming an indescribable repulsive force, which was to expel Luo Fan from this area to a higher level of Tao Master. In this situation, it was obvious that these Tao Masters were no longer willing to see Luo Fan here. Even if it was not the main meaning, it must be a part of it. It must be a part of it. Feeling this repulsive force, Luo Fan's eyes lit up. Not bad, not bad. This kind of manipulation does indeed have the momentum of a Tao Master. This kind of rendering of the void and mobilizing the power of the void, or in other words, mobilizing the power of all the strange scenes in the void to mobilize the power of the entire second level of the Tao Master's path, was extremely exquisite. It made him feel the foundation of these Tao Masters. Of course, although this kind of method was exquisite and unparalleled, Luo Fan was not to be trifled with. He wanted to use this method to expel Luo Fan. It was also unlikely. At this time, Luo Fan's heart stirred, and the eternal world suddenly released endless light. This light was somewhat similar to the rays of light in the outside void, but in essence it was completely different, even incompatible with the rays of light in the outside world. This light was none other than the transformation and condensation of the countless concepts contained in the eternal world. Judging from the source of these ideas, these condensed ideas were actually Luo Fan's worldview of the laws. Of course, because of the integration and transformation of the Tao Master's path, This worldview of the laws was already very different from the worldview of the laws that Luo Fan's current life origin had manifested, at least in terms of level. It had already improved by an unknown amount. As for the endless rays of light outside, they were endless concepts. These concepts were various and innumerable, and in essence, they were even more vast and boundless than Luo Fan's worldview. But the endless rays of light in the outside void had a weakness, and that was, it was extremely scattered. Although it contained endless concepts, the concepts themselves did not form a truly perfect system, but were evenly distributed, like the air, like the heaven and earth Yuan Qi. In the void, the countless strange scenes in the entire void provided the concept incarnation formed by the numerous cultivators. Compared to the concepts emitted by the eternal world, this kind of light was like a diamond, and the other was like graphite. Diamond and graphite were the same element, but because of the difference in their structure, the hardness of the two was like heaven and earth. Among them, the light emitted by the eternal world, which was also the world view that had been transformed by the Tao Master's path, was like a diamond, while the endless rays of light around it were like graphite. Or, from a higher point of view, there was no difference in the value of the two. However, for an existence at the level of Luo Fan, the value of the two was like heaven and earth. The power of the two was also like heaven and earth. Just like that, even though the rays of light were not completely unaffected by the terrifying waves created by the endless rays of light, they still managed to block the endless rays of light outside as they fluctuated. As a result, both the eternal world and Luo Fan, who was inside it, were no longer affected by the terrifying repulsive force produced by it. They were still firmly in this area, in the second layer of the Tao Master's path. It was even to the extent that even his concept incarnation wasn't really affected at this moment. It still existed outside the eternal world, and it was enveloped by the boundless light. It seemed like a god of creation. How is this possible? This is complete. Suddenly, many people below the Tao Masters were shocked. How can this cultivation method succeed? He didn't build it step by step, but from the very beginning He actually came here from the side road. This person has the qualifications to become a Tao Master. At this time, all kinds of discussions continued to come from all directions. The faces that emerged in front of the many strange scenes exclaimed inexplicably. Their faces became distorted, and it was almost impossible to see how many of them could maintain their original calmness. This kind of voice reverberated in the large void and spread to the ears of countless cultivators, making their hearts tremble indescribably. All of their expressions became puzzled and ugly. They could understand every single word spoken by these Tao Masters, but when put together, they couldn't understand anything at all. I didn't expect that someone would choose this kind of cultivation. At this time, a voice rang out from nowhere, instantly suppressing all the discussions. It suppressed the terrifying impact sound that reverberated in the entire void, causing the entire void to calm down. Then, a huge face appeared in the void. This face was so huge that it was beyond imagination. It seemed to blot out the sky and cover the earth, shrouding all the phenomena and the faces above. Compared to it, any strange scene, any huge face, they were like ants. At this moment, Luo Fan furrowed his brows and narrowed his eyes. He stared at the deepest part of the void, looking at a peculiar scene in the deepest part. That anomaly was pitch black and didn't emit any light in the void. On the contrary, the light emitted by the other anomalies was attracted by it and eventually disappeared into the pitch-black anomaly. The whole strange scene looked like a huge black hole. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan had not noticed that strange scene. He also did not notice that there were no faces in that strange scene. At this moment, he sensed that the huge face that towered above all the other faces was coming from that strange phenomenon. In other words, the owner of this face was in that incomparably huge black hole. The face looked like that of a young man. This young man's face could only be considered ordinary, but the wisdom in his eyes surpassed that of any cultivator that Luo Fan had seen in so many worlds, even true saints and Tao masters. He naturally understood that it was not because he had surpassed the true saint or the Tao master, but because the true saint and the Tao master Luo Fan could not understand it at all, let alone recognize the subtlety and mystery of it. Greetings, second senior brother. At this time, all the faces began to change and turned into figures that bowed to the face and greeted. There were hundreds of millions of cultivators under the 3,000 Tao masters, and they all called this person senior brother at the same time. One could imagine the prestige of this cultivator. It went without saying how strong he was. If it was not for his strength that could suppress everyone and make all the Tao masters submit to him, such a thing would not have happened. Junior brothers and sisters, there is no need to be so polite. The face smiled and said lightly. These words were very ordinary, but no power or barrier could stop them. They were directly transmitted into the ears of all living beings, and even made them naturally want to obey these words. They naturally wanted to act according to the will of these words. Yes. The many Tao masters responded at this time. Then, one by one, the figures turned to look at Luo Fan. There was a flash of understanding in their eyes, and even more of surprise. It seemed that the appearance of the second senior brother, because of Luo Fan, made Luo Fan different, and changed their view of Luo Fan a little. How powerful! Luo Fan just said lightly. The second senior brother's face slightly froze, and in the blink of an eye, he had already turned into a figure that appeared in front of the consciousness incarnation of Luo Fan, and said with an extremely humble look, "This is an unwritten rule of our Tao masters. If you are interested, I can explain it to you. In fact, there are many of us under the Tao masters, and in the past, when no one was willing to submit to anyone, many unspeakable things happened. Finally, after countless years of development, a senior finally came up with such a solution. In each layer of the Tao Master Path, the strongest person will be chosen to become the leader of that layer. I was lucky to defeat all the junior brothers and sisters, so I became the leader of the second layer, and was called the second senior brother. It should be the same in other layers." Hearing this, Luo Fan suddenly understood. The second layer was the second senior brother, the third layer should be the third senior brother, the fourth layer should be the fourth senior brother, and so on. This structure could not be said to be very exquisite, but it could be regarded as the integration of the entire layer of the Tao Master Path, and it could be regarded as a way to solve the contradictions between each other, and it could also be regarded as slightly easing the contradictions. It is really unexpectedly simple and crude. Luo Fan just said. It is indeed simple and crude, but there is no other way. After all, our real task is to cultivate, and everything else is secondary. The second senior brother said with a smile. Then, he changed the topic and said with a smile, "These are all secondary. This time I appeared, there is something that I don't understand and I want to ask you." Luo Fan said lightly, "You can ask, but I may not necessarily answer." Although the second senior brother in front of him was extremely strong in the second layer of the Tao Master Path, and could even suppress all the other Tao Masters, and had even vaguely reached the level of a three tribulations expert. But to him, he was still just a weakling. He still had enough confidence to easily crush him. Under such circumstances, there was naturally no need for him to indulge in such a situation. The second senior brother did not respond to his words, but many of the other Tao Master's disciples were already shouting in displeasure, "How dare you!" This voice directly swept up the endless rays of light in the entire void, causing these rays of light to wildly surge, creating a terrifying wave that directly swept towards the eternal heaven and earth, and also towards Luo Fan. In the face of these waves, Luo Fan only faintly smiled, and did not even do anything. The light released from the eternal heaven and earth had already in a slight tremble, and all the waves had been completely cut off, and Luo Fan himself was in the slightest bit unaffected. The second senior brother said indifferently, "Junior brothers and junior sisters, don't take it to heart. This fellow Taoist's strength is qualified to say so.